Welcome, Executive Director of the Aspen Strategy Group, Ambassador Nicholas Burns.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nick Burns, Executive Director of the Aspen Security Forum and Aspen Strategy Group. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. I should say good afternoon and good evening to those of you joining us from parts overseas. We're looking forward to a really good conversation today about how to assess the Biden administration's performance on national security in its first 100 days in office. And to do that, we have three conversations. Beginning in just a minute or two, we'll have a conversation with former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, former Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun, and that conversation will be moderated by our friend Jennifer Griffin of Fox News. At 10:30 a.m. here in the United States, we'll have a second conversation with the new Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, moderated by another good friend of ours, Helene Cooper, the Pentagon correspondent of the New York Times. And then at 11:30 a.m. this morning, so 2 hours from now, a third and final conversation, and that's when our good friend, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, will be interviewed by another friend from the Wall Street Journal, Jerry Seib. The Aspen Strategy Group has a radical notion that's the core of our mission, and that is that Republicans, Democrats, and independents here in the United States ought to be able to get along, ought to be able to meet together to talk about the major national security challenges that we face. We've been doing that for 37 years. I want to pay tribute to our current co-chairs, Professor Joe Nye of Harvard University, who's one of the founders of this organization, and Professor Condoleezza Rice, Stanford University, Director of the Hoover Institution, and the former Secretary of State. We're delighted that you're here with us today. I would just say, as a way of setting the ground for these conversations, we've seen a major revolution, in my judgment, in American foreign policy under President Biden's leadership. He has started with the belief, and the core belief that I think is right, obviously, that the United States has to repair itself at home, strengthen itself at home, strengthen the middle class here in the United States in order to be successful overseas. And thus, you've seen the president's focus on the pandemic, on the issue of refloating our economy, on the continued challenges to our democracy as evidenced by what happened in Washington on January 6th, and certainly in doing much more to make sure that America is a nation of racial equality and racial justice. Those four imperatives at home obviously have been the focal point of this administration, but we've also seen a major change overseas. We've seen a refocus on the power of our alliances, building up NATO to contain Russia, forming and having the first Quad meeting of heads of government so that Australia, Japan, the United States, and India are working to limit China's growth and China's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. We've seen a major focus of this administration on climate change in the appointments of John Kerry and Gina McCarthy, in the work of President Biden in hosting his first major summit last week, the virtual summit on climate change, attended by heads of government of all the major emitters in the world. That was a positive event. We're certainly seeing a major focus on China and our competition with China for military power in the Indo-Pacific, our competition on trade to make sure that China plays by the rules of international trade, which is not doing now. Our competition technologically in AI and machine learning, biotech and quantum sciences, and the militarization of those technologies. And certainly what President Biden talked about in his State of the Union address the other night. And that is the importance of democracies being self-confident and democracies being powerful and democracies taking on, in this battle for really for the future, the authoritarian powers who believe that their system is in the ascendancy. And as the president said the other night, and I think that nearly everyone in Congress would agree with him, democracy should be the way forward, and it should be the organizing principle for the world. And so there's a lot to talk about. We've seen major changes over the past 100 days. We look forward to a very good set of conversations this morning. Thank you for joining us. Each of these three sessions will be a conversation by the interviewer with our guests, and then we'll leave time at the end of each session For all of you watching and listening today, to answer questions, I think you all know Zoom technology. Just press the raise hand button. If you can't make that work, there's always the chat and Q&A functions. You can alert our staff to call on you for a question. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome two good friends of mine and of the Aspen Strategy Group, and two members of the Aspen Strategy Group, Tom Donilon, Steve Biegun, interviewed by Jennifer Griffin, Fox News. Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick. It's so great to be here today. I'm Jennifer Griffin. I serve as national security correspondent for Fox News at the Pentagon. I've been there for the last 14 years. I was overseas before that for about 20 years, with my last post in Israel for 7 years. And I want to welcome two guests who really need very little introduction. Tom Donilon, you served as the national security advisor to and senior advisor to President Obama on national security, and Steve Biegun, whose last job was as Deputy Secretary of State, but has served in government dealing with these very difficult global issues for so many years. I want to start with both of you about, take us into either the Situation Room or your last job, and talk to me about what was the most dramatic day or difficult decision that you had to make in those jobs. Why don't we start with you, Steve?
It's so fresh, Jennifer, that there are so many. Let me just start with one. My first day officially in office as Deputy Secretary of State was January 3rd of 2020. I came into the office with the intention to get a good start on my new position. Arrived around 6:30 in the morning. By 7 o'clock, I was called down to the State Department's Ops Center, where we were briefed on the imminent execution of a strike against General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And by 4 p.m., that strike had been completed. That was my first day in the office. There were many more that followed. A couple of days later, we detected signs of an Iranian counterstrike against U.S. targets across the Persian Gulf. It turned out to be a feint, but we had about 50 minutes to get every American diplomat underground in our embassies across the coast. I walked into the ops center and gave the orders for them to alert the embassies, and it was like something out of a movie. Those people are incredible in the State Department Operations Center. They got every embassy on the line. They had alert systems, watch systems. It really is a well-oiled machine, and it made the State Department Ops Center and the Ops Center team one of my favorite parts of the job as Deputy Secretary of State. Really an incredible group of young men and women serving around the clock to protect the nation's interests.
So these are some of the same kind of issues that President Biden is facing, and the kind of pressure that he's under. Tom, what was your most dramatic day in the job?
Well, there are a number of dramatic days. I mean, the most difficult days, Jennifer, are the days when you're making decisions as to whether to send men or women in our services, military services, into harm's way. And we had a lot of those decisions to make. When President Obama came into office, we had two hot wars with substantial troop deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we were about to increase pretty significantly the size of our force in Afghanistan. We had one of the most aggressive counterterrorism campaigns the country's ever executed. So those are the most difficult days when you sit with the president's making those decisions with knowledge that he's putting at risk and in harm's way are the men and women who serve in our military services. But probably the most dramatic set of events were 10 years ago this week. On Sunday, May 2nd, we will mark the 10th anniversary of the operation against Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. And this was the week when we were leading up to that. In fact, 10 years ago, the Thursday night before the raid, the president was in the Situation Room with his most senior advisors, asking their final recommendation on whether or not to go ahead with the raid, asking their final recommendation, their views on whether the raid was the right option, as opposed to other options that he had, a standoff bombing and some other options that we had. And it's a very clear memory and pretty dramatic when the president's sitting in the Situation Room, and the people sitting around the table were some of the most prominent people in national security in the United States. Joe Biden, now the president of the United States, Hillary Clinton, Bob Gates, Leon Panetta, Mike Mullen. sitting around the room, and the president asked for final recommendations as to whether or not to go ahead, and the room was split. And that we put it on our president, right? I walked back to the Oval Office with him after the meeting, and he had told the group that he would have his decision the next day, which would have been this morning, 10 years ago. I remember watching him walk back to the mansion from the West Wing of the White House, and it really striking me, that it strikes all of us, that we put these tremendous decisions on the shoulders of one person. And of course, the next morning, 10 years ago today, the president emailed around 7:30 in the morning and said, "I'd like to gather in the diplomatic room," which, as Steve knows, is a room in the ground floor of the White House where you look out at a tremendous vista of Washington. And he came in and said, "I've made the decision. It's a raid," and I had gathered there with Bill Daley, the chief of staff, and John Brennan, then the Counter-Terrorism director, and would be gone to be a CIA director, and Dennis McDonough, who was then deputy national security advisor and became chief of staff. He said, "I've made my decision. It's the raid. Draft the appropriate orders." And he walked out to the helicopter to go to Alabama to view storm damage. And so those were, and of course, then on Sunday we launched the raid. So we are on the 10th anniversary of some pretty dramatic events, certainly, I think, in the country's history, and certainly in my experience in the White House.
Absolutely. Steve, let me take you to look at the last 100 days since you left office. What's your assessment of how the Biden team is doing? What's the biggest mistake they've made so far, do you think?
Yeah, so when I was first invited to speak at this session, Jennifer, I have to say I reflected upon kind of the absurdity of taking a measure of an administration 100 days in. If anything, I think probably the measure of any administration should be taken on its last 100 days rather than its first 100 days. I actually looked back to see how we started using this as a metric, as a yardstick for measuring presidents. And according to the History Channel, the origin is in Napoleon's escape from Elba through his defeat at Waterloo, which transpired over exactly 100 days. And that became historically a marker for measuring success or failure of a leader. Franklin Roosevelt resurrected it early in his tenure, in his first 100 days as president, in order to mark the progress in fighting back against the domestic ravages of the Great Depression. And so here we are, we're stuck with a 100-day metric to measure something which is way too early. I would say that I've seen or participated in a few discussions over the course of the last week on President Biden's 100 days, and I just find them way too gloomy and way too pessimistic. Not about President Biden necessarily, but just about the country and the issues we confront. And I think there's some real positives out there, and I think they're worth highlighting. One is the country is not involved in major wars. We have troops serving abroad in harm's way in many places around the world, and we should never forget that, never forget them. But we aren't involved in any major wars currently, and no major hot wars were left to the Biden administration. We have an economy that's rapidly rebounding from the I guess the pause I would call it last week, because we had it last year, because we had a really strong economy going into the beginning of 2020. But obviously the shutdowns and everything else that were necessary to respond to the pandemic put it on pause, but it seems to be rebounding dramatically, all the more so with the stimulus that's being poured into it. We have a military that's strong and capable and well-funded. We have relationships around the world that the Biden administration is rapidly advancing. Our alliances and partnerships, the Quad, has been mentioned already. I will say that the leaders' meeting of the Quad was something that was part of an agreement at the end of the previous administration. In fact, the previous administration, I think, deserves enormous credit for having resurrected the Quad. It had not met once between 2007 and 2017. And during that interlude, it atrophied, but for a combination of reasons, including changing views of some of these partners themselves, we now have the makings of a very good partnership in the Indo-Pacific, and I'm very pleased that the Biden administration has taken that on. along with building better relations, restoring a more positive tone with our NATO allies, but a NATO alliance that's now far more capable because of the resources the previous administration demanded upon it. The last thing I'd say in the positive is that there is a strong bipartisan consensus on most of the major foreign policy issues we face today, at least the geopolitical ones, like climate change, immigration, trade, which have international dimensions, are still contentious issues. But in a national security sense, in a geopolitical sense, China, broad bipartisan common views. On Russia, the same. On North Korea, the same. I guess the one watch out I'd have for President Biden is there's also a strong bipartisan view on Iran, but it is not one that is necessarily going to be supportive of his policies. I believe that there is a strong bipartisan consensus on Iran to not rejoin the JCPOA in its current form. And I suspect if you put the JCPOA to a vote in the United States Congress, it would lose by a significant margin. Whether it could be done as a piece of legislation and therefore vetoable is that's the process that President Obama designed in order to create the patina of congressional support, or at least absence of 2/3 opposition. But I will say the one watch out is that President Biden has inherited a strong bipartisan consensus on the major foreign policy issues of the day, but in one, he's at risk of swimming against the tide.
And that's on the Iran deal. Tom, let me read to you from David Ignatius's recent column about Biden's first 100 days, where he says that countries are wondering whether the U.S. is a superpower in decline. Chinese diplomats lectured their American counterparts in Anchorage last month. Russia provocatively moved troops to the Ukraine border. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have secret back-channel contacts with Iran, even as they request more U.S. weapons. As Biden enters his second 100 days, he needs a clearer strategy for projecting power. Your response and your assessment of the first 100 days.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Steve said, by the way, with respect to bipartisan consensus around some of the major foreign policy, national security issues facing the country. But responding to David's piece, I'd say this. I think the most important steps that the United States has taken in the national security foreign policy area has been on COVID and economic recovery. This has been absolutely essential, I think, Jennifer. The successful ongoing campaign, a lot of challenges in front of us, but the ongoing campaign, successful to date, to distribute the vaccine and the economic growth that's following on from that is absolutely essential to the United States standing in the world. Why do I say that? It's obviously key to the health outcomes in the United States. That's key to the economic recovery. Steve's exactly right. Most of the consensus now is that the economic recovery in the United States could approach 7% growth this year, which we haven't seen in almost 4 decades in the United States. That, by the way, that's something maybe we can talk about later. There's a tragic divergence between the United States and the developed world and the emerging world, the lesser developed countries. But so it's important in terms of health. It's important in terms of economics. It's also important in terms of our standing in the world. That the United States has recovered this sense of resilience, if you will, of competence. I think as I reflect on it, since World War II, one of the essential elements of U.S. ability to influence the world, act in the world, has been the reality and the perception of its competence, an America can-do attitude. And I think this recovery of resilience has been absolutely essential in terms of U.S. position in the world, which we lost some of, I think, in 2020 during the course of the COVID crisis. It's interesting. I think going to Alaska, where, of course, Secretary of State Tony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met up with the Director for Foreign Policy at the Communist Party mechanism in China, Yang Shisha, and the Foreign Minister Wang Yi. It would have been really difficult to go to that meeting, I think, absent the passage of the American Rescue Act, which is the COVID Relief Act, and the snapback in the United States, both in terms of health and economics. So I think that the United States is on a path towards doing that. We're doing a number of other things. Obviously, Steve mentioned, I think, that bringing allies front and center is a hallmark of this administration. That is a strong instinct of President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken. Sequencing allies first in most of the policies that we're pursuing around the world. It's a strong team that's been put in place. I think a strong, experienced team. And one last thing I think that in terms of going forward, into demonstrating strength. We've also, I think President Biden has also brought the key issues ahead of us to the center of our foreign policy making. What do I mean by that? Climate, where the United States is now kind of joined into the consensus and trying to lead the effort around the world with respect to climate. On cyber, where I think we've really had a really terrific set of appointments and kind of a reorganization of how we deal with cyber, and on health issues. So I think the president is building a very, I think, good platform to project U.S. leadership and that kind of strength that David Ignatius is talking about. And the last thing I'll say on this is, it's something I don't think that you can, Nick, you can ask Jake about this when he comes in later today, but he doesn't use the phrase. But I think what the U.S. strategy is really reminiscent of is Dean Acheson's phrase of building situations of strength. That's what this is about. Situations of strength at home and with respect to allies, which is a unique American asset, and with respect to challenges that we face in the future. So I think that it's a big part of it. I think it's a big thrust of the Biden policy, Jennifer, is actually to kind of build out these situations of strength from which then we can operate and advance our interests.
Tom, let me just follow up on one of the points you make, and that is, don't you think the COVID recovery here in the US will be undermined if the Biden administration doesn't do more to get vaccines to India and Brazil? I mean, you could have two failed states. You could have, you're seeing states around the world as the virus rages in some of the developing countries where you could have, you have protesters now taking on the government because they don't have access to vaccines. They're dying by, the millions. It's not under control elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a super important question, Jennifer. I think in the first instance, of course, it is a U.S. responsibility. And I think, again, in order to allow us to kind of move up from our platform to deal with our challenges at home, including the virus and vaccinations and the economic recovery, he's doing that. But you're exactly right. The divergence in the world is really striking right now. And the fact is, of course, is that we won't be fully safe as Americans from this virus as long as it's still kind of at war with the world, right? So, and from a number of perspectives, right, including, by the way, the development of future variants, the longer this goes on. And so I do think that as the United States gets itself in a strong position, and we're seeing this already, you saw announcements yesterday that the United States is sending support to India. There's a big discussion, an important discussion underway today, right, about the lifting, if only temporarily, of intellectual property and patent protections around some of these, around the core vaccine products, and in order to have them produced more easily around the world. But I think that's a challenge, Jennifer. I think that kind of is now kind of becoming front and center for the United States in terms of policy and for the world. We do have this tremendous divergence, and it is going to have to be addressed through, I think, strong and creative work to try to get more progress in the emerging markets. And we see this in Latin America. As well as in India. It's a really important question, and it's going to require a lot of effort and creative work.
Tom, it looks like we might have lost your video, so why don't you, I'll turn to Steve while you work on that. Steve, we saw Russia make some moves, Putin make some moves. It seemed like he anticipated that. He knew that the response was coming. Biden had said that he was going to respond to the SolarWinds hack as well as other recalibration of the relationship. President Biden called him a killer in that interview with ABC. What do you think was behind Putin's moves to the border with the Ukraine? Was that a bluff? Was that just to divert from what was happening with Navalny at home? What was behind it? Was he ever really thinking of invading Ukraine or moving further into the Donbass?
Yeah, Jennifer, that's a very good question. And I think that one that many of us who follow Russia closely have been puzzling over, or were puzzling over. And even now, it's not a complete stand down, but it is significantly less tense than it was. I'm not absolutely sure President Putin knew what his goal was there, at least what his final goal was. But I think his initial goal was to make it clear that Russia would not be ignored, and that Russia had tools at its disposal and it could influence the course of events. And in a sense, that is correct. That our ability and much less our political willingness to defend the Ukrainian-Russian border is simply not there. And so it was a reminder, I think, of sorts. Whether or not it was intended to generate the kind of attention it got, and in some cases, the response probably was something the Russians would not like. Many Russian diplomats have been expelled from countries around Europe and here in the United States. Various forms of Russian misbehavior are, if anything, under increasing scrutiny by the United States and its partners in Europe. I'm not sure it was entirely the return he wanted, but President Biden did something that I personally think was a good idea. Was he also proposed to sit down with President Putin in a summit? I know that many of my brethren in the analytical community on Russia disagree with that decision, but I do think that I can see the contours of what the Biden administration is trying to do with Russia. The initial wave of sanctions, and I do think that the reference to Putin as a killer was a word that is something that President Biden simply blurted out, and frankly, the words were put into his mouth by the interviewer, and he went with it. I think, on reflection, probably his advisors would not have encouraged him to say that. But as we always do in politics, there's a quick circling of the wagons in an attempt to make a virtue out of misstatements by our leaders. I've had to do it, and I'm sure that my counterparts in this administration were compelled to do the same. But setting that aside, what the Biden administration, the broad strokes of the Biden administration policy on Russia seem to me, first to reset it and try to find the bottom. And so the sanctions, I think in administration officials' words, the sanctions were kind of unfinished business, a correction of sorts to get us to a point where we have made clear what our bottom line is on both election interference information campaigns targeting U.S. candidates and on issues like intrusion into U.S. networks with the potential for sabotage. The second part of the Biden administration's policy, and one that I think Secretary Blinken has advanced very quickly, is working closely with our partners, particularly in Europe, to try to have a common front on the concerns we have with Russia. And I think both of these are achieved. Now, having set those stages, you move to the third, which is an engagement. And I can't possibly predict what the outcome of a summit would be between President Putin and President Biden, but we should know soon enough, because the National Security Advisor to President Putin at least has indicated that summit is likely to occur in the next 2 months, and so we'll know. So, I think generally the administration is on the right track, and unlike many of the other policy issues here, they've done something which I would encourage them to do as well, which is they acted a little bit unconventionally. If I had one critique for the Biden foreign policy, and it's something probably many countries around the world welcome compared to the last 4 years, is that it's becoming very conventional and predictable. Now, there are advantages to that, of course. We're a big power, and you want to move slowly, and you want to telegraph where you're going. So there are advantages to that. I'm not critical of conventionality, but occasionally look for the opportunities too, unconventionally. And I think that's where the previous administration actually had its greatest successes, is when it acted unconventionally.
What was the most unpredictable thing that President Trump did that you thought helped the nation from a foreign policy perspective in hindsight? What maybe surprised you, but then led to a breakthrough?
Yeah, well, we can talk about North Korea at greater length later, but at a minimum, President Trump tested the proposition that the North Koreans have long advanced, which is that if only the leaders could meet, then all things were resolvable. We learned an enormous amount in my meetings with the North Korean counterparts over the course of the last 2.5 years on where North Korea is, what's the nature of its system, what its direction is. And we also managed to maintain stability on the Korean Peninsula after a cycle of escalation that transitioned from the Obama administration into the Trump administration that in 2017 seemed like it was very possibly leading to a war on the Korean Peninsula. The other one was the Abraham Accords. Hidebound, barnacled foreign policy disputes from half century ago were preventing the successive U.S. governments from taking action that could bring greater peace and stability in the Middle East. And the Abraham Accords, which were kind of a classic foreign policy of the previous administration, a combination of transactional, detached from the conventions and the strictures that previous presidents felt compelled to abide by. Jennifer, just in the Middle East, I have worked on every Republican presidential campaign since 1996. Every single party platform called for the relocation of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Every single one. And by the way, the Democratic Party platforms did as well. And no president did. That happened. Things have shifted. Those are unconventional acts that have created, in my view, a more peaceful and stable potential for the Middle East than that inherited by the previous administration.
Tom, you were sent by President Obama 3 times to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And you see there have been incidents with Iran gunboats for the first time, twice in the last month, coming up to US warships in the Persian Gulf. The Israelis clearly don't want the talks to move forward on the negotiations for a nuclear deal. They don't believe it'll work. Do you feel that the Israelis are playing a positive or a negative role right now with regards to Iran? And how concerned are you about the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps going its own route against, separating and really calling the shots in Iran and perhaps provoking the U.S. military into a conflict?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, I just wanted to follow up on Steve's good comments on Russia, because I do think there is bipartisan look at this. I do think it's fair to say, Steve, though, that President Biden comes at Putin a little more differently than President Trump did. I think that's a fair statement. He's known him a long time. He's had encounters with him, and I think he has a firm view as to the kind of the hostility across the board that Putin and Russia faces here. And so it is a different personal approach, I think, that President Biden will take. I do think that it's fair to say that the initial steps have been to deal with some of these kind of leftover business, historical issues, particularly with respect to solar winds and election interference and things like that. One thing I'd add to your points, though, on the importance of having NATO together and focused on Russia, which I think that President Biden, and of course, Biden and Blinken are committed Atlanticists, right? This is really where they have come from in their careers, and so there's a strong view with respect to the importance of NATO. I just wanted to mention 2 other things, Jennifer, and then I'll get to the Israel Middle East point, which is it's also the importance here in the United States. Yes, contain Russia aggression, absolutely, but also to engage in steps in the United States where we protect ourselves much better, and that goes to the cyber issue, where in fact I do think we have a lot of work to do. If you look at the current state of the cyber world, we have shown that SolarWinds is a good example of this. We can't protect our federal networks at this point. We have difficulty protecting the very tools that we have with our intelligence services. Shadow brokers showed that. We have an epidemic of ransomware in the United States. I think that's a really important and building crisis. We have the build out here of an Internet of Things system with thousands and millions and billions ultimately of sensors, and we don't really have policies to kind of build in security from the start there. This is a really important, I think, point for us to focus on generally, but also with respect to Russia. And the second is Russian corruption, where I really do hope, and I think you'll see that. And again, you all talk to Secretary Hicks and National Security Advisor Sullivan today. I really think that focusing on this transparency, anti-corruption efforts, the number of pieces of legislation that passed out of the Congress on this is really important. Now to the Middle East. Sorry about the diversion there, but I think those are important points. I think with respect to I do know the Israeli team quite well, as you pointed out. And they were obviously dissatisfied with the Iranian nuclear deal. I have a different view than Steve, kind of on the history of this and maybe where it is today. I think the nuclear deal was actually working. It was not meant to be a transformational effort by the United States to transform somehow every Iran or all the malign behavior that Iran engaged in. It's an arms control deal. It was an arms control deal, and by every account, it was working in terms of rolling back and freezing the Iranian march towards efforts towards a nuclear weapon. And I do think we need to get back to some sort of base from which we can operate and start to deal with some of the additional problems, including ballistic missiles and the conduct of Iran in the region. Now, on Israel, and again, I don't, you read the reports. I don't have any classified analysis as to exactly what the roots were of the latest attack on the Natanz nuclear facility and the attack on the power supply there. I think most people assume that it's Israel. But the important point was this, is that right after that attack, the Iranians still came to the table for the proximity talks in Vienna, which I think indicates the pressure that they're under, and I think the Iranian desire to reach some sort of deal from which we can move forward. The United States and Israel, I think, have had important talks on this. Again, the Israeli team was just in Washington this week to go over this and other issues. So you'll have different views on this. I think in some ways the pressure that the Israelis put on Iran moves them, incentivizes them to move on a deal. I do, by the way, think that Steve's point on the Abraham Accords is correct. And I think it's something on which the Biden administration looks to build.
Let me interrupt and jump into follow up on the cyber issue. It's obviously both, you've spent a lot of time on it, Tom. Steve, you were at the State Department when the SolarWinds hack was taking place. Steve, do you think that the Biden administration's response to SolarWinds was strong enough?
Well, I think their punitive measures, which I would say, I would hasten to point out, National Security Advisor Sullivan said will be seen and unseen, seems sufficient and well conceived to send a message and try to reinforce a norm that is going to be necessary for all countries to abide by if we're going to have an open internet globally. But I also want to say that there's a lot more that needs to be done, and I have full confidence that President Biden's administration is well underway to do that. They have an outstanding team in the White House working on these cyber issues to lead this effort. They are looking at comprehensively at the weaknesses in the system, the vulnerabilities that oftentimes are a side product of the free and open society that we choose to live in. I was listening to someone much smarter than me on these issues a few days ago talk about how if we had to do it over again, we might have made this a national infrastructure, that the internet and the nodes and the servers system and all that runs our daily interactions on the internet might have been better done as a government initiative. Now, leaving aside the fact that market drivers likely are why it was so successful and why it's so ubiquitous, it does raise a very important vulnerability, is that the internet and cybersecurity are only as strong as the weakest link. And I would reflect at the State Department that we had 76,000 employees based in embassies and consulates in nearly 200 locations around the world. Each person in those embassies would have at least one device, a mobile device, maybe an iPad, maybe as well as a desktop or a laptop. And every minute of every day, they were under attack electronically by both state and non-state actors. It is a formidable challenge, Jennifer, and one that fundamentally we have to do better ourselves. I think the first, I appreciate and support what President Biden did in response to this. As I should hasten to add, in case Tom misunderstood me, as I agree with much of what he's done on U.S.-Russia relations. But at the end of the day, if we're going to get better on cyber, it's got to be us. We've got to be better. And I know the administration is working hard on this.
Jennifer, just to comment on Steve's point, because he's exactly right. This is I chaired the National Commission on Cybersecurity in 2016, and we actually briefed into the Trump transition at the beginning of 2017. He's exactly right. We designed the internet without security in mind. It was basically seen as and it turned out to be a spectacular invention and opportunity for the world. But we have systematically and consistently neglected the security side of this, and we need to do a much better job on this. And we got to start with our federal networks, as I said. It's just we are not anywhere near where we need to be in our federal networks. It needs to be a priority. That we're still using passwords and don't have dual factor authentication, kind of the basic things here,
Yeah.
is really not, no tech company in this country, by the way, would operate with that level of with that deficiency in security. We have lots of things that we can do. We can use the federal procurement system, by the way, to force change into the system as the biggest buyer of things in the world. I think we can have kind of intense efforts around trying to deal with ransomware. But it's interesting, Steve, I think you're exactly right. It has to start with us. And there'll be a lot of discussions in the Situation Room about high concepts of deterrence and whether it's cyber attacks can be deterred and all that. And that's really important going forward. But we need to start with the nuts and bolts where we're really deficient in the United States, frankly. Nicole Perloff has written a really good book from the New York Times, right, on this, which she points out that essentially we haven't really spent anywhere near the time, attention, and resources on the nuts and bolts defense of United States networks, and we need to start doing that in a big way. I agree with you. The team that Biden's brought in is really superb, with Nan Neuberger in the White House, and now nominations of Chris Inglis, whom you know, Steve, and Jen Easterly at the new position of cybersecurity director in the White House, and the head of CISA. I think it's a good team, but the focus on these fundamentals and what we do here, I think, has really got to be given a higher priority.
We have only a few minutes left, and I'd like to tell the audience that we'll have, in 10 minutes, we'll take your questions, but I want to spend the rest of our time talking about China and the potential flashpoint that Taiwan poses. You had 24 warplanes buzzing Taiwan in the last few weeks. There was a discussion on Capitol Hill. DNI Avril Haines said that maybe was asked by Senator Jack Reed, whether it's time to abandon strategic ambiguity. I'd like to get both of your thoughts on that. Is it time to issue a warning really to China that it's no more strategic ambiguity? We will defend Taiwan if they're attacked. You can start, Steve.
Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer. This debate about whether or not to do away with strategic ambiguity has been simmering for some time. People like Bob Blackwell, Phil Zelikow have written very intelligently about this. Richard Haas has done the same at the Council on Foreign Relations with others. Here's what I would say about ambiguity. Ambiguity works if the deterrent is convincing. And clarity does not work if the deterrent is ambiguous. So we have to do one of two things. We either have to make clear to the Chinese government that we will defend Taiwan, and that we will do whatever it takes at that moment if they choose to move on Taiwan, recognizing, in my view today, that it is a gamble as to whether or not we can defend Taiwan sufficiently despite that clarity. Alternatively, we can keep the policy of strategic ambiguity, but we need to make it much more clear to the Chinese that they will be defeated if they seek to change the status on the Taiwan Straits through coercion or the use of force. That means initiatives like the Biden administration's efforts to advance even further the Quad alignment that they inherited. That means transforming the U.S.-South Korea alliance. I commend the Biden administration for very quickly moving to solidify the U.S.-South Korea relationship by agreeing to the cost-sharing formula under the Special Measures Agreement. They did this in their first few weeks in office, but that was never the issue. The issue is transforming the U.S.-ROK alliance so that it is part of our Indo-Pacific strategy and our shared interests in the Indo-Pacific strategy. And here lies another challenge, I think, that's out there for this administration or any administration, is that many countries in the Indo-Pacific aren't clear where they want to come down, and frankly are uncomfortable getting drawn into the middle. We've heard it from the Kiwis in New Zealand. We've heard it from the Singaporeans. Last 2 years ago at the Shangri-La Forum in Singapore, the Prime Minister of Singapore pleaded to not have to pick sides between the United States and China. And we hear it very much coming from Seoul today as well. Now, our policy should not be pick a side. Our policy should be to systematically build out the capabilities and relationships that create a convincing deterrent to China that says that, yes, competition is fine, but coercion or the attempt to subvert other countries or to change the status quo on the Taiwan Straits through the use of force, those will be deterred, and we need to do better in order to get there.
Steve, would we go to war over Taiwan to protect supercomputer chips? There's been a lot of talk of that recently.
Well, the United States said it will defend Taiwan in the case that there's an attempt to change the status quo by force. You're not going to go to war if there's a leveraged buyout of TSMC, but certainly this only adds to the concerns, which is that Taiwan has a remarkable success in producing the most sophisticated computer chips in the world today, and that production is exclusively located on the island Taiwan. But the concerns are bigger than that. It's not just about chip technology. It's about the basic march of freedom in the world and the rights of self-determination within the systems. We support a one China policy, but we do not support the subversion of Taiwan's democracy as part of that equation. That is for the Chinese people to sort through without the use of force.
How is Biden's approach to China different from President Trump's?
There's a lot of continuity, particularly in the end. And I have to say that the meeting that I saw, with the parts of the meetings that we saw in Anchorage, was very similar to the three such meetings that happened at the same level in the previous administration. I think one of the things that constantly frustrated. One of the self-inflicted wounds of the previous administration is the inability to work to sort issues to primary, secondary, tertiary, and focus intently on addressing the issues of primary concern. And so it was challenging at times to be, on the one hand, working ever more closely with the government of India in bolstering the Quad and in improving the participation in the Malabar naval exercises in the Indian Ocean, and then at the same time have a different part of the government imposing punitive tariffs on Indian products because they were being brought in the United States in competition to U.S. industries. And the incoherence of that made it very difficult to advance partnerships. I think the Biden administration has inherited a very good platform in the Indo-Pacific, but I think they have huge upside potential to strengthen and deepen that, to regularize that, and to maybe even make some of these relationships into more durable structures. It is the wheelhouse of the Biden administration and the very capable people who lead its foreign policy and national security. And it's an area that I think is rich with opportunity for the Biden administration.
I agree with that, Jennifer.
I want to give Tom, I want you to respond. We're starting to run out of time, and I want to get to questions, but I also, China is so important. I want to give you a chance to respond, Tom.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think I appreciate what Steve said. I think that there's been, as I said, there's a bipartisan consensus in this country with respect to China and us moving to a much more competitive phase. It's embedded now, I think, in U.S. policy. That's what President Biden's actually said. We're in a period of extreme competition, and he was very clear about the competition in his talk to Congress on Wednesday night. Couldn't have been clearer. I think there are 3 or 4 differences, though, Jennifer, which I'd point to. The first is, again, building out on some of the work that the previous administration did, but really much more intensively on the allied piece. And Steve mentioned the basing arrangements and cost sharing arrangements in Korea. The work I think that can be done here on the trilateral relationship among the United States, Korea, and Japan. That's all, I think, front and center. But critically, I think, is the domestic renewal agenda. What President Biden laid out in his talk on Wednesday night, with a number of allusions to China and the challenge that China faces in terms of a kind of a fundamental, if you will, kind of decision in the world, right? About the future of democracy and the ability of it to deliver for its people. This domestic renewal with a particular focus on technology is absolutely critical. That the United States identify those areas, those technologies where it's important for it to continue to have leadership, and it acts decisively with resources and focus to do that. That really is, I think, kind of a critical difference here as we move, or the next evolution, if you will, as we move forward. I also think with respect to defense, we need to have a focus on doctrine and resources, and Eli Ratner, the Defense Department's lead. And the last thing I'll say is there's a much bigger focus on human rights.
I don't want to forget Afghanistan, and looking out for the next 100 days before we quickly go to questions. What do you think the next 100 days, the biggest challenge will be, and how will we avoid Afghanistan, the pullout from Afghanistan ending the way the pullout from Iraq did, and us having to go back in? Tom?
Yeah, I don't think the two situations that we can have an all morning seminar, and I don't think the two situations are at all comparable between Iraq and us implementing essentially what was the Bush deadline to December 31st of 2011 and the situation in Afghanistan. I think if you were to step back and just sit again, Jennifer, you started this conversation by asking about situation room meetings, and if you were to go into the President of the United States today and do a global threat assessment, look around the world and ask yourself, where should we apply our resources? You wouldn't have a significant military presence in Afghanistan. And so I think the challenges going forward here are to obviously execute the withdrawal safely over the time between now and September 11th, 2001, that we need to develop and adjust the intelligence focus operations suite, as Bill Burns called them in his testimony, kind of the suite of capabilities we have to anticipate and contest reconstitution of terrorist threats. And then, of course, to work on the military over the horizon capabilities that we have. I have a lot of confidence, by the way, that we have capabilities in both those areas, both on the intelligence side and in the military side, to be able to continue to protect the country. I think we'll have strategic warning with respect to the reconstitution of terrorist threats, particularly by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I think we have the military capability that we've developed over the last 20 years to deal with it. And the last thing I'll say is we have leverage on Afghanistan, aside from military leverage, and that includes the fact that 80% of the Afghan national budget comes from foreign assistance. That's a lot of leverage on whatever group of people is governing Afghanistan going forward.
Great. I'd like to turn to questions in our last 8 minutes, and I'll start if you can introduce yourself and then explain who you are addressing your question to. We'll start with Farah Pandith.
Good morning, and what a pleasure it is to see you. I have a question that's actually related to what Tom was just saying about CT more broadly. The first 100 days has been focused obviously on domestic terrorism and what happened on the 6th of January, importantly. But we're increasingly seeing the ideology of the far-right extremists be executed around the world in different kinds of ways, and actually has challenged our imagination. So the threat landscape on the ideology of extremist groups has changed. So my question is, what should the administration be doing as we think about the next 10 years of millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha being subjected to the kind of far-right extremist ideology alongside the resurgence of what will be the so-called Islamic State type ideology? Thanks.
Tom, you want to take that?
That's a big topic, obviously. I think a couple of things. I think, and it's nice to see you. One is that, as you said, the Islamic radical terror threat has not gone away, but it has been diminished. I think, again, if you cite Real Haynes and Bill Burns' testimony at the Worldwide Threat Assessment Briefing 2 weeks ago, indicated that, over the course of the last, decade and more, we have diminished that threat. It hasn't gone away. It's been dispersed. As I said in my earlier conversation with Jennifer, I think we have the ways to both have the intelligence that we need on it and to have the military doctrine, capabilities, techniques to deal with it. This issue, though, about right-wing extremism, is obviously front and center in the United States. But I agree with you. It's a building issue around the world, and one that I think in the first instance needs to be called out. And part of calling this out, by the way, I think is the construct, if you will, that President Biden laid out in the speech on Wednesday night, which is this construct between a democracy and authoritarian regimes, including the critical point about the ability of democracy to deliver for its people. But this conversation, I think, is exactly right about the threat of right-wing extremism to core democracies around the world. Is an important conversation, and one that needs to kind of become front and center. And I think that President Biden began that conversation on Wednesday night.
And now I'd like to go to Christopher Painter, who has a question.
Good to see you again, Tom. Chris Painter, in the government for many, many years, formerly in the government doing cyber stuff.
Yeah.
Back on the cyber issue. Look, I agree with you that defense is really important and we need to do that better. But there's also the other half of the equation, which is imposing costs and trying to at least shape the behavior of our adversaries. And we haven't done that very well, frankly. We certainly haven't done that very well with Russia. So what I see is a calibrated response so far from the Biden administration, both hitting them, but also trying to engage in dialogue. But what other things can we do that would actually shape Putin's behavior? I think there's a lot of things people have talked about money flows and other things that we haven't really gone to. But is this something where we can shape his behavior, or are we going to just have to continue to deal with a very aggressive Russia in cyberspace and outside cyberspace for the foreseeable future?
I think, and certainly Steve can comment on this as well. I think that a number of the responses, Chris, to Russia's cyber attacks in the United States has to be outside the cyber realm, and that obviously is sanctions. But I think I just think we can do a lot better on the defensive side. But it is basically doing our best to kind of create the environment around Putin in which he has to operate, and that begins, I think, in Europe, as we've talked about, with respect to having NATO much more focused on the Russia threat with U.S. leadership. But it's kind of an all of the above assessment, don't you think? That we need to kind of bring to bear, outside the cyber realm, pressures on Putin, and engage on rules of the road with Putin. The other piece of this, of course, more broadly, is the constructing of alliances around these technology issues, outside the construct of kind of the core alliances of NATO and the various alliances we have, and the more general alliances we have in Asia, but constructing bespoke alliances around these technology issues, I think is an important step that we can take. There was a really important piece by Richard Fontaine and Jared Cohen in Foreign Affairs last year on the creation of these kinds of alliances, which I think can establish norms in the world, ask like-minded countries to join, and to I think establish kind of rules of the road which makes sense for us in the world.
We have, we have time for just one more question. Elizabeth, economy.
Thanks so much, Liz Economy from Hoover and the Council on Foreign Relations. Really fantastic set of remarks. Thanks to both of you. So when we talk about allies and partners, we often are focused on Europe and Asia, sort of our traditional allies and partners. But when you look at what China brings to the table, when we criticize them on Xinjiang or South China Sea or Hong Kong, they bring 30, 40, 50 countries from Africa, sometimes from Latin America, Southeast Asia, developing economies, Middle East. How do we begin to reach out to these countries that are supporting China, in fact? How do we begin to expand what we consider to be allies and partners so that we really begin to make some headway into this block that China has created?
Yeah. I think Steve should take that. Steve's was most recently on the front line of diplomacy in that area, Steve.
And I'll just mention, Steve, we're coming up against the end of the program, so we have about 1 or 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Well, Elizabeth, thanks for the question, and I think you're absolutely right. And it's parts of the agenda we haven't talked about that are going to be very important to us deepening our influence. It's going to be resolving issues around refugees and immigration, around aid, around restoration of the global economy. There's a huge opportunity for the United States with foreign aid to shape the recovery of the world from the COVID pandemic, a pandemic that's still very much upon us, as has been said. And also the climate issue may offer an opportunity here. We need to work through international institutions like the Organization of American States, the African Union, the Arab League, aside from all the instruments that we've used and perhaps overused in Europe over the last 30 years, I think the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe offers us a huge opportunity to build out those relationships. So it's going to be a combination of our traditional uses of softer power, maybe not entirely soft power. It's going to be working through organizations with effective diplomacy to get aligned views on issues that challenge all of us. And lastly, I think it's going to be the United States modeling a behavior in the world that has a healthier and more palpable dimension of altruism. I think the United States' world to win over on the side of a rules-based international order, and I'm confident that opportunity can be really achieved.
And Jennifer, I would just underscore the climate point that Steve made as a real opportunity for U.S. leadership. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I want to thank you both. We're up against the end of our program, but I think what's extraordinary is how much bipartisan agreement we heard from both of you, serving two very different administrations. And it gives us hope that the nation can come together on foreign policy and national security issues. Nick, I'll throw it back to you.
Jennifer, thank you so much for your really good moderation of a panel that could have gone on for another 1 to 2 hours. And I want to thank my good friend Tom Donilon and my good friend Steve Biegun. I agree with you. My takeaway from the last hour, and I listened very carefully, is we're a badly divided country, but Republicans and Democrats in foreign and defense policy on the major issues are thinking alike. I think there is a degree of bipartisanship. I hope we'll see it. Certainly, Steve's right. When Steve said that the Trump administration had revived the Quad, he's exactly right. And now you've seen President Biden take it to the first head of government meeting. I think on China, there's a recognition we have to compete with China. We have to contain Russia. We have to rebuild NATO. And this last conversation that you had, very important, about advancing our cyber capacity in the world, and the appointments that have been made at the National Security Council there, so important. Finally, Jennifer, I just throughout this conversation, the need for us to have self-confidence as a democracy. That's a Democrat and Republican issue. And to take on the authoritarian powers, as the president has been suggesting in every opportunity that he's had, it gives me hope that despite our domestic difficulties, we Americans can be together on foreign policy. So Steve, thank you very much. Tom, thank you very much. Jennifer, thank you. Now we're going to have other people come up. And as Tom and Steve and Jennifer say goodbye, you're soon going to see the faces of Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks and of my friend Helene Cooper of the New York Times. And I want to welcome them both here for the next hour. Helene is going to have an interview with Kathleen. I'd ask them both to activate their video. There's Helene, and I'm sure Kath is going to come up on the screen in just a minute. Let me say a word about Kath Hicks. Kath Hicks is universally admired in Washington, universally recognized as one of our finest experts on American defense, given her long experience in the Pentagon, given her service as the Henry A. Kissinger Chair at CSIS in Washington. She's a reformer. She's someone with deep knowledge, and we're very happy to have her here today. And Helene, we're very happy to have you here today. Helene Cooper has had a magnificent career with the New York Times. She and I first got to know each other when she was diplomatic correspondent of the Times when I was Undersecretary of State. She went on from there to be White House correspondent and now has been a Pentagon correspondent, has won many awards for her journalism, someone I deeply respect. And so, Helene, I'm going to turn this over to you for your on-the-record conversation with Kath Hicks. And it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Nick. And I can't see Kath. Is she here yet? I don't see her yet on my screen.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
Kath, welcome.
Okay. I was worried that Nick and I were going to have to talk to ourselves.
You can do that. That's okay with me. I'll listen intently.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Kath. I am hoping that since you agreed to do this Q&A with me, that you've forgiven me for my ginormous blunder a few years ago with CSIS when I was supposed to talk to Admiral Mullen, and I forgot that I was traveling with Mattis at the time. And you were really cool about it. So, but I'm really sorry again. Before we jump to Afghanistan, which is, as you can imagine, where one of the main things I'd like to talk to you about, I wanted to just start off with a more general question about your relationship with Lloyd Austin, and something that can give us some insight into how the two of you are running the building. You're both historic figures at the Pentagon. Is the division of labor along the same lines as past defense secretaries, where the deputy runs the day-to-day business of the building, or are the two of you approaching your jobs completely differently?
Sure. Well, first, let me say thank you to Nick for the kind introduction, and to the Aspen Strategy Group, and to Helene for interviewing me. I do remember, but it was all very strategic, Helene, because it's going to pay off today, because you owe me one big.
I do.
Let me just say, I did come with prepared remarks. I can give those remarks at the beginning, or we can jump right into the Q&A. I just want to pause and see what your preference is.
I think you should start with your prepared remarks. I forgot about that.
No problem. And I'm happy to pick up on the great question.
And then we'll come back to the question.
Fantastic. All right. Well, in any case, it's great to be with all of you this morning, though admittedly, as much as I do love the Pentagon, as you can tell from my repeated stints here, seeing you all in person in Aspen would be far preferable to sitting here virtually as we all are on Zoom. So I was asked to share some thoughts with you today about the Department of Defense's initial priorities. I'm going to focus those comments on competition with China and highlight what the department is doing already to meet this challenge, especially in regard to innovation and modernization. This is an issue I've worked on substantially over the years, and as a recovering defense strategist and the Secretary of Defense's COO, to the question Helene was going to ask me, it is at the core of my priorities as Deputy Secretary of Defense. As Secretary Austin made clear early in his tenure, mission one for the US military is to defend the nation. Understanding why we are modernizing and what we are modernizing for begins with an appreciation for the challenges that imperil that mission. We have never had the luxury of being faced with only one threat, and today is no different. From COVID-19 to climate change, from Russia to Iran and North Korea, from advanced technology and weapons proliferation to creeping authoritarianism and violent extremism in its many forms. Our nation and our military must constantly be assessing risk across time and space. It is clear, however, that the comprehensive challenge posed by the PRC sets the pace for most defense requirements. From the President's interim national security strategic guidance to Secretary Austin's message to the force, our administration has been clear-eyed. Beijing has the economic, military, and technological capability to challenge the international system and American interests within it. This is happening all along the continuum of conflict, from routine statecraft through the use of sharp power or gray zone tactics, to the potential for sustained combat operations and an expanded and capable nuclear enterprise. As an example, Beijing continues to leverage its maritime militia to press its unlawful maritime claims in the South China Sea. The PRC's military capabilities are rapidly advancing in a number of areas. The PLA continues to make progress, strengthening its ability to conduct joint operations, build readiness, and field increasingly sophisticated conventional forces, such as long-range conventional missiles and integrated air defense systems. The PRC is also advancing its space and cyber capabilities. As recently heard from the Office of the DNI, China presents a prolific and effective cyber espionage threat and possesses substantial cyber attack capabilities. President Biden has stated that while there is going to be extreme competition between the United States and China, we do not need to have conflict. In advancing American interests, we anticipate the US military will often serve as a supporting player to diplomatic, economic, and other tools. Central to the military's value is demonstrating the will and capability to credibly deter PRC aggression. This will best position us to avoid a conflict. In extremis, where our vital interests are threatened, we will ensure the US ability to fight and win. In the Biden administration's first 100 days, the Department of Defense is moving out to transform the rhetoric of competition into reality. We are committed to leveraging the greatest strategic asset we have in deterring China, our network of partners and allies. For the US military, our defense relationships strengthen interoperability. They generate common norms and respect for responsible international behavior across domains, and they deepen the agility of our collective global response. Success may depend on how we work with our friends to secure our common interests and common values. In a recent trip to the Indo-Pacific with Secretary Blinken, Secretary Austin highlighted a number of the collective issues that the US-Japanese alliance faces. And he underscored that our alliance remains resolute and resilient because of our shared values and history of shared sacrifices. Additionally, Secretary Austin and I have moved quickly to overcome institutional inertia, which exists within any large organization. We have instilled disciplined processes and governance structures throughout the defense enterprise. Our FY fiscal year 22 budget will provide early insight into our strategic approach. The president's budget request reinforces the investments needed to compete effectively. It will support defense research, development, test, and evaluation funding. This will lead to breakthrough technologies that drive innovation and underpin the development of next-generation defense capabilities. Where the nation's security needs are no longer being met, the budget provides the resources to phase out systems and approaches optimized for an earlier era. It will set a sustainable shipbuilding plan to ensure our maritime capability outmatches any competitor. The request will modernize our nuclear deterrent and invest in long-range fires capabilities. And it will leverage the Pacific Deterrence Initiative and ensure that the United States builds the concepts, capabilities, and posture necessary to meet challenges posed by China. Our global posture review and national defense strategy efforts now underway will guide further changes. But even now, we are incenting innovation at the department to develop new operational concepts and capabilities. We are embarking on a campaign of learning marked by experimentation and rapid fielding. This will be focused around several key joint operational challenges vital to our success. There is no single point solution or enabler that sparks innovation. This means that we are making department-wide cross-cutting adjustments related to culture, people, systems, and process. We are actively thinking about the strategic levers available to incent innovation. For instance, DoD must look to bridge the valley of death, so-called, for the gap between the innovation or creation of a new platform and the ultimate acquisition of it by the department. We can do that through disciplined and coordinated joint experimentation. The department must leverage our unmatched test and lab infrastructure to spur both innovation and competition across the public and private sectors. And we need to be sure that DoD's vast ecosystem of innovative organizations is sufficiently integrated and optimized. This means being able to share best practices and key findings focused on the most important national security challenges. And the department must continue to aggressively take steps to be a data-centric organization. Data enables capabilities such as AI, machine learning, and various autonomous technologies. It is critical to warfighters seeking advantage on the battlefield, and it is critical to decision makers. More transparent and credible data shines a light on the department's use of force, for instance. In so doing, it will help us maintain our strategic focus rather than succumb to the death by 1,000 cuts of daily crises. To better leverage data, we will continue to implement the department's data strategy. We will give our data leaders a seat at the table and invest in our data talent. And we will develop enterprise analytic capabilities. Simultaneously, as we develop new concepts and capabilities, we must ensure that they are protected from our adversaries. To that end, the department is looking at different ways that we can work to shore up vulnerabilities in our supply chains. Even today, prime DoD contractors and mid and small size suppliers source components, including critical components like microelectronics, from our rivals. We also depend on adversarial sources for critical materials. Solving these problems takes a comprehensive government strategy, but there are a number of actions we can take at DoD. Those include reducing our dependency on adversarial sources and increasing the diversity of domestic suppliers. Relatedly, DoD is working with other departments in the US government that are members of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. We are ensuring that the principles that guide CFIUS's decision-making continue to protect America's technological advantage. Namely, we should construct objective standards and presumptions that cannot be overcome unless mitigation efforts can resolve national security concerns. Doing this will increasingly preserve our capabilities. Additionally, we are working closely with Congress. A real, enduring, bipartisan consensus has emerged around the multidimensional challenge that Beijing presents, as Nick commented at the end of the last session. Democrats and Republicans alike recognize that the department must prioritize the PRC as the pacing challenge to the United States. This cooperation with Congress is critical to ensuring the department receives the support required to deter aggression. Let there be no doubt, China presents a real and enduring challenge to our department. Our own inertia, though, can be a significant barrier to meeting the moment. In highlighting some of the measures that we have taken in just the first 100 days of the Biden administration, I want to impress upon you the imperative Secretary Austin and I feel to adapt our strategy, capabilities, and forces for the future. Thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to speak today. Helene, I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Kath. This was fascinating. I really want to get into some of the China issues that you just mentioned, because that's such a big deal at the Pentagon. But let's jump first to Afghanistan.
Sure.
Because it is such a, it is very much the subject that is on the mind of everybody in the building, the ending of America's longest war. We've all heard about how President Biden came to his decision. We've heard a little bit about the over-the-horizon planning underway at the Pentagon for trying to keep the place from becoming another launch pad for terror attacks on the United States and our allies. But how concerned are you about a scenario like what we saw in Saigon in 1975, when the South Vietnamese government fell and we had helicopters evacuating Americans from rooftops? Do you anticipate that we will soon be seeing that in Kabul?
No, Helene, I don't. I want to stress both President Biden and Secretary Austin's emphasis on a safe, orderly, disciplined withdrawal process, and that is our focus. We will have the ability for self-defense for our forces that are there, and we will execute on that as needed. But I want to jump kind of to the premise of the question on the over the horizon and counterterrorism. You know, it's not 2001, it's 2021. And over the intervening 20 years, the United States has developed a wide range of tools that we didn't have. We have new structures. We have the National Counterterrorism Center. We have a Department of Homeland Security. We also have, of course, a wholly new a suite of capabilities, from space to cyberspace to unmanned systems and other approaches. We have new CONOPS of operation. We have better collaboration between CIA, for example, and other actors, the IC in general, and our partners and allies. So there's just a completely different landscape in which we are operating. And as we do in almost every other part of the world, executing on our counterterrorism mission without having substantial forces on the ground is the general way in which we approach counterterrorism. So in Afghanistan, we have achieved the goals we went in for in 2001. We have demonstrated, we've removed al-Qaeda and demonstrated that we will not tolerate it being a safe haven for use against United States citizens and territory. And we will continue to hold those vital interests and hold the Taliban and any other actors inside Afghanistan responsible for living up to those expectations.
But is that over the horizon planning dependent? I mean, I assume, are you factoring in the possible fall of Kabul?
I'm not going to get into operational details. I think it's fair to say we're thinking through all the contingency operations, but we are working on the military side alongside a political effort, a diplomacy-centered effort that's very much focused, not just from the United States, but around the region and around the world on ensuring that Afghanistan is able to protect, the most critical interests for the international community. If you're asking if we're prepared for how the United States can protect its own citizens and its forces, the answer is, of course, we do that planning and we are prepared to do so.
No, I'm not. I have no doubt that we will be able to evacuate the embassy in plenty of time. I think I'm more focused on just the ability of the ANSF to survive once the American forces are gone, and just just how much of your planning is assuming that the ANSF collapses and Kabul collapses. How much time do you think you have?
I think you're asking a wholly different set of questions that aren't, if you will, on point to the president's overall message. And the message is, we are protecting the vital interests of the American people by ensuring that Afghanistan cannot be a safe haven for terrorism. That will continue to be true for terrorism that is threatening to the United States at home. If, in terms of how the Afghan peace process moves forward and the way in which the Afghan government, if you will, manages through, we have been very clear in our support for a negotiated settlement and approach, but that is not central to how the United States plans for itself, both in terms of the over-horizon capability and any enduring interests we have inside Afghanistan as it relates to terrorism.
Okay. So tomorrow is May 1st. There's been a lot, and this is my last Afghanistan question before I want to move to China. There's been a lot of confusion about what happens in Afghanistan after tomorrow, particularly when it comes to the US providing air support to the ANSF. Does the US plan to continue to provide air support to the Afghan security forces after tomorrow if they come under attack from the Taliban while we are going through this? And I had never heard the whole phrase military retrograde operation before, but now I have some new Pentagon lingo I can fling around. But during the withdrawal, are we going to continue to provide air support to the ANSF if they come under attack from the Taliban?
So the United States, again, has an approach that is definitely protective of the orderly withdrawal of the US. We do have coalition partners, including the Afghans, that we will be working with as we go through that process. And so if your question is sort of a May 1 question, the answer is yes. The United States does have within its planning efforts that it will be working with a coalition partners. Those include NATO allies and, of course, the Afghans, and will be able to provide support as we withdraw, including, to your point, if they come under attack during that withdrawal.
Thank you. That's clear. There was a lot. I'm sure you saw sort of the confusion earlier this week on that. Okay, so let's move to China. China is expected to surpass the US as the world's biggest economy by 2028. And China is gaining on the US in military power, as I'm sure you know. Do you believe then that a military conflict with China is inevitable?
I don't believe it's inevitable. And I think a key aspect of the United States ensuring it does not become inevitable is demonstrating the credibility and will on the military side, where we sit at DoD, to thwart any such efforts that would violate, direct U.S. interests. That, of course, will be only a piece of that overall national security approach that is diplomacy led. So there are lots of other areas in which the United States and China will contest the rules of the international road in the economic sphere and other spheres. And there are also opportunities for cooperation that hope to draw away from conflict. But in the military realm, I think what we can do is first ensure we understand escalation patterns and try to avoid unnecessary escalations. But at the same time, secondly, demonstrate that will and credibility to deter aggression that violates our interests.
Well, on the point then of escalation patterns, what is the biggest trigger? What do you worry? Do you worry more about Taiwan being the trigger, or do you worry more about South China Sea Islands, which I still remember Joe Dunford famously got angry at us because we overheard him talking to Harry Harris in the Pentagon saying, would you go to war over over the Spratly Islands? And we put that in the paper and he got mad. But on a serious note, should we be more worried about Taiwan being the trigger, or what concerns you more?
Yeah, I think that there's no a priori answer to that question, Helene, because it really depends on at any given point in time where the Chinese have in their own minds where they might try to press advantage. So that's why it's so critical that the United States be really clear about our interests, whether it's around Japan, whether it's around South China Sea, to your point, and or Taiwan or elsewhere. So I don't have an answer that is I worry about one or the other. We watch diligently daily all of these spaces. We think in time about China. We worry about China today and making sure we can signal correctly today. We worry about it 5 years down the road where there's shifts in capability and perhaps intent from the Chinese. We'll be watching that. And we worry about it on the 10 to 20-year trajectory where there, for example, nuclear weapons capability and other areas of growth start to shift the landscape to different kinds of military approaches from the US.
It's so weird listening to you here talk about this, because I remember when I first started on the Pentagon, it was in 2014. Chuck Hagel was SecDef then, and then Ash Carter. And we took fairly regular trips to China, defense secretary trips. They were always filled with tension, but we went, and there was far more engagement. And then we shifted to the Trump administration, and Mattis never went. Neither did Esper. Neither did, I've already forgotten the guy who was between the two, Shanahan. And then the sort of the high level engagement, SecDef to SecDef, occurred only on the outskirts of maybe the Shangri-La meeting where they'll snatch 30 minutes and talk. And we seem to be going down this trajectory. There's nothing planned now. I mean, how are you doing the sort of military to military engagement with China? Where do you see that? Do you want to restore it to a more traditional type of where they actually are talking in a real way, or
Sure. Absolutely. The United States and China have every reason to be speaking to each other across a range of issues, inclusive inside that are military issues, cyber, et cetera, which start to bleed out of DoD into other areas. We absolutely in this administration and inside the Pentagon are looking forward to those engagements. It's not a one-way street. We don't make all those decisions, and those conversations with the Chinese are ongoing about how best to set up those engagements. I'll just add that's at the strategic level, even at the bridge to bridge level, if you will. That's vital in terms of de-escalation abilities. So our ability to talk, that you may recall the CUES agreement that the Navy came to with the PLAN, all of those sorts of channels of communication are vital to us understanding we're in competition. But again, as the president has said, competition does not necessarily equate to military conflict, and it's in the interests of both the United States and China to prevent that.
But there's nothing on the schedule from any high member of the Biden administration.
I will just Well, first of all, the president has reached, I'm trying to understand your question. The president has had a conversation with Xi. The Secretary of Defense is working through engagements with Chinese counterparts. We are trying to get that set up now. It's not because we're trying to prevent it, but again, please recognize that the Chinese have their own views about engagements with the US. And of course, you'll remember the Alaska, the Anchorage engagement that has already occurred as well. So we're lining up behind that. DOD doesn't need to be the first, should not be the first out of the gate. We've had the president, we've had the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, and we are working now on DOD.
Turning to Russia and Ukraine, I just have one question I'd like to ask on that.
Sure.
Moscow withdrew a few thousand troops from the Ukrainian border last week, but there's still thousands there. What do you make of Putin's maneuverings on the border? Do you think he's basically just trying to mess with Biden and send a message on, Defender Europe? We're going to do NATO exercises on his border. He can show us that he can mass troops. Or is he actually thinking about going in to do something about this North Crimean water issue?
I think the key from our perspective, of course, we're watching everything that happens day to day. As you say, there have been some withdrawals. We've been pleased to see those, but we are monitoring routinely, and we are not underestimating or trying to guess at the instincts or day-to-day desires that President Putin may have. So we're watching it very carefully. We've been very clear about our commitment overall to Ukraine's sovereignty and being able to protect itself. And we're very hopeful that these signs that you're indicating show that there was an exercise underway, that the Russians may want to be signaling certain things beyond just their exercise, but that there is not actually a decision made to undertake any stepped up military action beyond what they already do in gray zone in eastern Ukraine.
Okay, we have only about 10 minutes left on questions. I'm trying to keep my eye on the clock at the same time. And I wanted to turn to more domestic issues in the building. But before I do that, I guess this is sort of in the building. I wanted to ask you about Jedi. A federal court ruled earlier this week that Amazon has a valid case to challenge the award to Microsoft. No thanks to Trump's meddling. Now this capability, which has already been on hold for 2 years, could be delayed again. Are you going to continue to delay moving on Jedi until this sorts itself out in court?
Well, as you might imagine, I can't comment on the court case, but I will, and I'm not going to comment on specifically what DOD is going to do, but I will say, as my comments indicated, it is absolutely vital that we are able to move forward on a data-centric approach in the department. We must have ourselves secure in cyberspace. The department weathered, for example, SolarWinds relatively well compared to other parts of the government, but that's just the latest wake-up call. We have every reason to think that we have adversaries who are trying to get into our systems every day. So for all those reasons, moving to a cloud architecture is going to be vital to how we innovate in this department. And we're going to have to assess where we are with regard to the ongoing litigation around Jedi and determine what the best path forward is for the department.
Okay. So back to my first question about you and Secretary Austin. How are you divvying up? Are the two of you, the idea that we have a female deputy secretary is almost as exciting as the idea that we've got a Black defense secretary. Just how aware are you of sort of the groundbreaking role that you both are in right now? And is any of that affecting how you're approaching? This is a stupid question, but I'm trying to get at, is that affecting how you're approaching your job? How do the two of you view this opportunity that you both have right now? Is a big historic first step. Do you let that influence how you do your job?
Yeah, well, let me first say back to the question you asked before I started my remarks. It is a relatively traditional, it's always varied from one team to the next, but relatively traditional CEO, COO model. So let me answer on that piece. in executing on our responsibilities, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't think about it's implicit, I think, probably in what I do, that I've grown up through a national security structure where women were wildly underrepresented. And that we have a lot of challenges still today inside the department, civilian workforce, and probably more prominent in the press military workforce challenges that relate to gender and of course relate to other aspects of diversity. So that's implicit in what I do. I don't do it from a conscious basis, if you will, in terms of being the first female deputy secretary. I certainly take that as a great honor, a privilege, and an incredible responsibility. But it's more around, that responsibility is more around being the deputy secretary at a time when and supporting a secretary who is historic in terms of his role, but also as at a time when the department's needs are so substantial and we are ready to reform this department.
Okay. Well, then on the issue, because there are two issues that the department came into office, and Secretary Austin, I think within 3 days of walking into the building, took on extremism and sexual assault. Let's start with sexual assault. Because I know that's something that you have focused on as well in your time there. Has the time come to take the handling of these sexual assault cases in the military out of the military chain of command?
Where we are right now, Helene, is we're looking at all potential solutions that move the needle. You know that the Independent Review Commission has come in with a viewpoint on that, which is to take it out of the chain of command. The secretary is reviewing that input, talking to, obviously, Senator Gillibrand has a bill as well. There's going to be other legislative viewpoints. And then we have a very deliberative process here inside the Pentagon where commander viewpoints and certainly the viewpoints of the leadership of the military departments will be important in informing the secretary's decision. So what I would say that I think you can count on is we believe accountability has to be part of the solution set. Prevention is incredibly important, but we're not leaving accountability off the table. We know that there's a lack of trust and faith in the institution to deliver. We can see that of course, in deep dive reviews like the Fort Hood report, and we can see it in our data in terms of what we hear back on sexual harassment and sexual assault. We are going to be solution oriented and deliberative. So if we think a solution can deliver on increasing trust and increasing accountability, and most importantly, decreasing incidents of sexual harassment and sexual assault, we will be interested in that solution.
Have you been surprised at the depth of the problem, though? I mean, in the last three,
no.
Yeah. Can you expand on that?
I'm a woman in the modern American workplace. I've worked in national security. I understand the challenges. I talk to victims. It's not surprising. It's disheartening. I think it's disheartening for everyone in the system. I think, if you talk to the military leadership, they would say the same thing. The question is, how do we move the needle? No one is satisfied with where we are.
But why? We have been writing about this and calling the Pentagon out. The Pentagon has been grappling with this for years now. We've done year after year after year. We're doing the same stories over and over again. And every year, each new administration that comes and says, we're going to wrestle with this. Why is this so hard?
Well, that's a whole conversation. I think it's tied into a set of behaviors and cultures that are challenging. I mean, you mentioned, for example, extremism. We also have violence prevention challenges, even on self-violence. I mean, we have suicide rates going up. So there's a whole set of issues that make us have to wonder and understand leadership culture, prevention activities, and how we think about readiness of the force in a holistic sense. Sexual assault and sexual harassment are one major and important manifestation of that, but there are others. So I think the reason it's hard is back to those root cause problems. So we definitely are going to pay attention to sexual harassment and sexual assault, and we're going to pay attention to extremism, but we're also going to pay attention to suicide and mental health and other factors, if you will, that all seem to point to general challenges on leadership. we have amazing leaders in the Department of Defense, but this is clearly, these are signs and signals that that we have challenges we have got to deal with. And I think you have reached a point in time where between the Fort Hood report and movement in terms of viewpoints on Capitol Hill and new leadership in the department, we're ready to take these challenges on. Agnostic on the solution set that we arrive at, as long as it delivers.
Okay, on extremism then, you say you weren't surprised at the fact that the sexual assault issue was such a big deal, that continued the depth of it at the building, in the building and at military bases around the world. What about, I remember on January 6th, covering the Capitol riots and watching, and there were many number of Marine flags out there. There were many number of military, you know how many military and former military enlistees and service members took part in the riot, and the riots. The Pentagon sort of has reacted in the number of generals and officers I've talked to about this. It's been very interesting looking at the reaction of them. We didn't realize that this was such a big problem. Is this something that we all sort of knew was there within the military? And how do you go forward from January 6th?
I think the first issue that is what I just talked about, which is thinking about that connectivity of leadership to the soldier, sailor, airman, marine, and space guardians that they're overseeing. On the civilian side, same thing. We oversee the total force, a very large civilian federal workforce as well as contract workforce. And there's a real question, I think, about the degree to which we have, like the rest of society, sort of hived off things that, in terms of personal space, and social media being a very prominent example of this, where there are real implications that come to display on times like January 6th, other incidents, whether you're talking about extremism like we saw at Fort Hood or at the Navy Yard, which is a different motivations. But similarly, point being, violence playing out in the workplace or violence playing out inside society from our workforce. So not surprising in the sense that it's reflective of larger society. Very disturbing that it's a higher percent of that broader society. And we know that from the intelligence reporting that military and former military are highly desired recruits. They are being actively recruited into extremism being all kinds of types and flavors, but in approaches that go counter to the oath of office that we take as civilians and as military. So as I said before, we know the vast majority of people who get up every day, either put on the uniform or come in as civilians or contractors, are mission focused around supporting the United States of America. But we live within a society and with technological means in which, as we saw back with Al-Qaeda all the way to today, where the flash to bang of radicalization is both difficult to detect and much quicker than it used to be. A Timothy McVeigh of the 1990s put into the system today, with social media as it is, you can imagine how much more difficult, if you looked, for instance, at terrorism overseas, how much more difficult that is to deal with. So it is a real concern for us. We're getting after it in insider threat programs that have already been underway. We're looking at things like security clearance reform approaches. We're thinking through our monitoring, just as the intelligence community does, monitoring of our unclassified systems, for example, to make sure they're not being misused for these purposes. And all the while, we're keeping right at the center, of course, the right of Americans to free speech, and the fact that this is not reinforcing time and again, this is not about politics. This is about supporting the oath of office people take and ensuring we're looking left and right at our teammates and making sure they're healthy, they're mentally healthy, and they're not succumbing to recruitment practices, whether it's from a foreign power, from a counterintelligence perspective, or it's from a radicalizing web page.
It's such, just listening to you talk about, it's such a hard issue. And it's clear because you have to balance the rights of free speech. You have to balance all of these things, but it just seems like it's going to be such a huge hill to climb. This is my last question before we move to Q&A, but we've got a primary, the Pentagon the American military still has a predominantly white general officer corps, particularly when we get to the top 4-star levels. Do you think this predominantly white cadre of white guys, and when I say white, I mean white and male, are actually going to, in a real way, look for ways to open up their ranks to more women and minorities and pay the attention they should to a Black Secretary of State and a female deputy?
Bottom line, I do. I think they have, in all the conversations we've had internally, I think they show incredible commitment to the challenge set. I think they see the challenge. I think having peers in their group, in addition to the Secretary and I, when you look at the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, for example, General Brown, African-American male, who spoke out very eloquently and early last summer around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in his own personal experiences. Those conversations are deeply meaningful, and they're meaningful at a personal level, whether you're the entry-level recruit or you're sitting at the top of the pyramid as a 4-star. And I think they have been very energized to make sure that we can tackle this extremism problem as well as this DEI challenge inside the services. And to your point, then you add in the president and vice president and the secretary and I, and I'm confident we will make progress here.
Well, we all wish you the best on this. It's going to be fascinating to cover. I'm so interested in what you and Secretary Austin are trying to do on these two really big issues. And, we wish you all the best of luck. I'm looking forward to writing lots and lots of stories about this. Nick, I will turn this over to you because I think you are handling the Q&A. Unless he's gone out for coffee. There you are.
Getting a coffee.
So that was a great conversation. Thank you very much. I am actually not handling the Q&A. That's going to be done by Neve King, who's going to participate, I think, arrive on the screen within one moment, and she'll get the questions to Kath. But Kath, thank you for being with us.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for your questions. Our first question today is coming from one of our new rising leaders, Elisa Sabinius, please.
Hi, I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News. Thank you so much for being with us today. I was fascinated by your remarks on China. One interesting thing in the first 100 days has been a series of hacks on US organizations that analysts have said may have roots in China. I'm curious about your thoughts on the biggest cyber threats coming from China and your strategy from a DoD perspective for handling them.
Sure. As I said earlier, I think, Elisa, that should assume, I think maybe is the safest way to put it, a good undergirding assumption for us is that we will be under pretty much constant attack from a variety of state, non-state actors in cyberspace, in DoD. And China is the most capable of those. As the Russians have proven, they're not so bad either. I'm not trying to incite them to try harder here. But the Chinese have incredible long-term capability. So how do we think about that? Well, of course, we think about on the defense side, making sure our DoD networks are defended. And that has to do with all kinds of upgrading approaches and routine cultural shifts, often called cyber hygiene, that we should be undertaking, and we monitor that very carefully, and we have benchmarks that we're moving against to make sure we're improving there. One thing as the Deputy Secretary that I can do, other than setting the standards and holding people accountable, is helping to provide the resources for those capabilities, and so that's something that I'm very much focused on. Also on the and I'll just add into there, upgrading our systems overall as part of that storyline. On the beyond defensive side, We obviously also need to demonstrate that there are costs for cyber attacks. And President Biden has most recently demonstrated that, I think, with Russia in terms of his response to SolarWinds. And that's the kind, we need to continually hold cyber actors accountable when they are undertaking activity that threatens us. The last thing I'll say is the defense industrial base. I stated this in my opening remarks, but we have a lot of vulnerabilities in the industrial base, and cyber is one set of those. And that's a priority for the department, is trying to both be able to assess and understand those threats to our defense industrial base. I mentioned microelectronics, for example, as one area, and make sure we have strategies designed to protect those, whether that's about increasing and then diversifying U.S. supplier bases or other approaches that can help to protect us.
Thank you. Our next question is from Courtney Kube, the NBC Pentagon correspondent. Courtney? Okay, if we don't have Courtney there, we'll move on to Leslie Thomas, please. Leslie.
Hi, thank you very much. You framed President Biden's Afghanistan policy as focused on the prevention of the use of Afghanistan as a launchpad for attacks against the United States and United States citizens and interests. We don't want to be in endless wars. Nobody does, but we did look at, the Soviet withdrawal and the US disengagement a long time ago. And what happened there could obviously happen again and is on everybody's minds. In a world in which lots of us received notifications that 300 people are on a civil society assassination list last week, in which a woman was whipped in Herat last week, and these are activities that are or are not approved by the Taliban. Are there sticks as well as the carrots that Thomas Donilon referred to, 80% of a budget that we may or may not want to provide to a government that does these things? And how can those be used constructively?
So I think, Leslie, you framed that up, I think, just right, and in particular in referencing Tom's comments, that there are mostly non-military approaches that make sense in 90% of the cases in the world where we are trying to shape the behavior of other countries. And when it comes to human rights, for instance, that's an area where we use a lot of different tools, whether it's economic sanctions, whether it's approaching, different statuses or tiers of status for countries with regard to privilege in the international community, whether it's government support and funding, as you alluded to. Those are all sticks, if you will, that the United States has at its advantage. Because the administration has prioritized U.S. global leadership and has manifested that by working closely with allies and partners, that gives us much more leverage with those tools than we would have if we were not, if we had chosen more of an America First approach that ignored the interests and values that our allies and partners bring to bear. So I just want to, because you brought it up a little bit in the context of women's rights, I just want to foot stomp that we care very deeply about the rights of women inside Afghanistan, inside Saudi Arabia, inside other parts of the world. But this is not about boots on the ground. This is about how the United States conducts foreign policy to advance its human rights interests using all the tools at its disposal.
Our next question is from Jane Harmon, the President Emerita of the Wilson Center. Jane, thank you.
I'm trying. Have you got me? Yeah. Okay, here I am. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Excellent conversation. As you know, I spent 9 terms in Congress, and then I was a member for a decade of the Defense Policy Board before Madeleine Albright, Henry Kissinger, and I and a few others were removed a month before the Trump administration ended. My question is about your good goal of modernization and innovation in the military. It is a good goal. I strongly support it. However, it has a huge effect on Congress. And one of the things you said, the defense industrial base is vulnerable, no question, but it's also vulnerable to losing jobs. And what worries me is twofold. Number one, the people in those jobs are highly trained, rocket scientists and so forth. But number two, if you move to modernization, you're going to threaten a lot of the activities in various congressional districts and get a lot of blowback. So what is your strategy? One thing that I'll just add that worked in the 90s was dual use technologies, helping firms do more in the commercial sector so that they could keep people employed. How are you thinking about a management plan for Congress?
Yes, very, very good question. And you are absolutely right that this is at the heart of how, if we want to modernize and move forward, we have to do it in close cooperation with Congress. This is very much I would say, the DoD part of the Build Back Better message and theme, which is it's not simply that we're divesting. It's that we are developing a U.S. both manufacturing and STEM-oriented workforce work base for the systems and approaches we need in the future. We need systems and approaches in the future. We are not divesting to do nothing. We are divesting to shift. And so, as you point out, Jane, anything from transition assistance, where we've done that, for instance, for BRAC before. So when for those who don't follow that, when we close a base, we provide assistance in and around to the community for transitioning. And those have been incredibly popular, very successful in terms of taking areas where the community thought they really needed that installation in order to thrive and survive. And now they can use that with transition assistance, use that for commercial approaches. We can use those kinds of ideas. I'm not saying exactly the same as BRAC, those basic approaches of incentivizing transition to new capabilities and new technologies and new approaches. We absolutely need to protect our critical workforce skills. You can look at anything from shipyards and the aerospace engineers that we have. Vital interest for us, and we talk a lot internally, at least with the secretary and I here, about having a sustainable approach. So moving away from focus on how many this or that platform we're building, and more about how sustainable is that? Are we ensuring an enduring industrial base? Is there a workforce there for the kinds of capabilities we need in the future? So those are the sorts of initiatives, exactly as you described, that we are trying to make sure we have in place, particularly as we move to looking at the FY23 cycle, which is the year essentially that we are approaching in terms of our planning. This will be centerpiece to how we think about some of the changes we may need to see.
Thank you. And our last question today is coming from Patrick Tucker, who's Defense One's technology editor. Thanks.
Hi, I'm not sure how to, let's see, there we go. Hey, Dr. Hicks, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
So there are reports that indicate over the most recent budget, there was some disagreement between the Pentagon and the White House. And so I wonder if you can characterize that discussion a little bit, but moreover, when you look across the broad spectrum of Pentagon spending right now, from nuclear weapons modernization and modernization priorities across all the services, where can the Pentagon realistically make cuts while also meeting all of these big modernization priorities? Thanks.
Sure. So I would not characterize it that way. I would say that the characterization that's factual is that the Secretary and the President came to a agreed viewpoint that was not difficult, if you will, for them to arrive at on where the department should be and how it made sense within the overall budget. So that's first thing. Second thing is, how do we take cuts? Obviously, the shift in our approach overall in terms of op tempo and use of forces around the world is central to how we can transition more toward looking at challenges like China in the future, and improving the toolkit in other parts of the national security sector beyond defense. So we're not always answering first with military capability or military forces. That depressurizes, in particular, as you know, the MilPERS and O&M accounts for us. In making sure also that we're not trying to replace back to quantities one for one, but we're really looking at capability. We are, as you well know, Pat, we are in an era where platforms will always matter, but it's the software, it's the quick turn, it's the munitions, it's those pieces that make such a critical difference in our capability set. And that's a different funding picture, I think I would say. One of the most fascinating things I found is that the only thing people know really about our defense budget is the top line, and everyone's arguing over it. They have no idea what's in the budget. And that tells you everything you need to know about the state of the debate in Washington. The defense budget's too high, the defense budget's too low. It's neither of those things, I think, unless and until you understand what's in it. So when we roll this budget out, I am confident that we will have areas, first of all, of risk that we will be able to identify and talk through. But I'm also confident that we're putting forward a really high quality budget that does the things I talked about in my prepared comments in terms of preparing us for the competition with China.
Thanks. If I may sneak in one more quick question, please, Dr. Hicks. We have some questions in the Q&A box about Myanmar. Could you talk to us about that, please?
I don't know what the question is.
It's just in general, your thoughts on any actions that the United States might take with regard to Myanmar.
I will plead outside my area of responsibility here as the Deputy Secretary, so I'm going to sidestep that.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think now we're ready to turn it over to Anya Manuel, who will introduce. Thank you very much, Dr. Hicks.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Kath, for doing a masterclass and walking us through the many issues that the Pentagon faces right now, from China to Russia to the ongoing cyber attacks and the critical internal transformation that you're leading. So we're very excited to have you in this seat. And thank you so much for joining us. And also thank you, Helene, for really insightful and thoughtful questions. Without further ado, we are now moving to our next and final session. I know we have Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, joining us. He is just in the process of getting in our green room behind the scenes. And we have Jerry Seib from the Wall Street Journal here to interview him. Let me just, while we're getting Jake online, let me just do a little bit of an introduction of him. Many of you, of course, are familiar with Jake Sullivan. He is currently the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs after having already a distinguished career in government. Previously, he served as the National Security Advisor for Vice President Joe Biden. And before that, he was the Director of Policy Planning at the US Department of State and the Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And of course, as many of you know, and many of you worked with him, he also was the Senior Policy Advisor for Secretary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. Jake clerked for Judge Stephen Breyer on the Supreme Court and Judge Guido Calabresi of the US Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. So he's really an underachiever. And all of us who've known him for a long time also know that he is an incredibly kind and approachable person. Let me pause here right before I introduce Jerry and just make sure that we have Jake.
Hi, Anya, can you hear me?
Hey, yes, I can. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. And Jake, you have an enormous portfolio, of course, and you are serving a president who has made really bold promises about transforming our foreign policy. We've heard already, you weren't able to be on, of course, but we heard earlier in the sessions from Steve Biegun and Tom Donilon. There was remarkable agreement between them on the challenges that the US faces and how to handle them. Kath Hicks focused on China's capabilities, competing effectively with China, and said actually that she thinks the US military will be a supporting player to the diplomatic and other tools there. You have Iran, where we understand indirect talks are underway. The president has said he's going to be tough on dictators and has already launched 2 rounds of sanctions against the Russians while saying we're going to find ways to work together. And of course, the administration is talking about ending the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We had President Ashraf Ghani here with us at Aspen a couple of months ago. And of course, that's not the outcome he would have preferred now. But so we look forward to hearing from you on all of those issues. Here to talk to you about each of these issues is Jerry Seib, who is a distinguished journalist and the executive Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal, where he writes the weekly Capital Journal column. He, of course, also reported from the Middle East earlier in his career and has covered the White House and has won more journalistic awards than we can mention here. So without further ado, Jerry and Jake, I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And Jake, good to almost be with you again. I just want to make sure that I'm on here.
I can see it, Jerry.
Great.
I'm really
Okay.
happy to be here
Excellent.
and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. You know, Jake, as I thought about this conversation today, it occurred to me that I might ask whether at the 100 days mark, and this is the 100th day mark, you could articulate a Biden doctrine in foreign policy. And then it occurred to me that we know what the Biden doctrine is. The president has told us it's a foreign policy for the middle class. So the question really is, what does that mean? What does that foreign policy for the middle class mean? And what's different about it from what we've seen over the years?
Well, first of all, Jerry, it's great to be with you. Anya, your overly generous introduction, thank you for that. But especially thank you for your leadership at the Aspen Strategy Forum and all the work that you've done to pull together just an incredible group of speakers, leaders, thinkers to grapple with a very difficult set of issues. And when you were walking through the set of challenges that we're up against, I was sort of reflecting back on 100 sleepless nights because there is a big world out there, and it's a number of significant threats and challenges for us to grapple with that we'll get the chance to talk about. With respect to the foreign policy for the middle class, I would just start with a kind of basic proposition that President Biden measures the efficacy of everything that we are doing in our foreign policy, our conduct abroad, our relationships, our engagements, our choices about military deployment based on whether or not it is going to make life better, safer, easier for working families in the United States. Now, that's a kind of an obvious statement, but it bears restating, which is why from his perspective, that he wants everyone to be quite explicit about the centrality of working in middle-class families to the decisions that he is making in our foreign policy. So that's at kind of the basic level. In addition to that, then, as we think about the challenge of China, or as we think about how we rack and stack significant threats, that metric has actual real-world consequences. It means that climate and COVID and cyber all have to be significant priorities in our foreign policy because of their direct impact on people here, significant and direct impact on people here in the United States. And then when it comes to the US-China relationship, our focus in the economic domain, in the technology domain, and in the diplomatic domain is in ensuring that we are holding China accountable to play by the rules so that American workers, American businesses, American families are not undermined or harmed by China's practices or conduct. And so that has an impact on how we approach US-China policy, which I'm sure we'll get into further as this conversation goes on. So foreign policy for the middle class is a concept. I would not call it the Biden doctrine. I would say it is an important element of the approach that the president has laid out. And what I've just kind of described is kind of my best effort to distill in practice how it impacts the decision-making that the president is pursuing in the foreign policy domain.
Well, and as you said, China is central to that. So let's go there next. China is a competitor, and it is a more aggressive competitor. I think we see what China is doing on technology transfer, on technology theft, on trade in the South China Sea, on Taiwan, and on internal dissent. I guess the question is why? Why do you think we are looking at a more aggressive China, a more aggressive posture that preceded, your entry into office in this administration? Why do you think that that's the case now? And what did you take away from the Alaska meeting that helped you perhaps answer that question?
Well, our assessment is that the Chinese government has made a few determinations over the last 5 years or so, and those determinations are guiding their foreign policy. First, that the hide and bide strategy should be shelved in favor of a much more aggressive and assertive posture in terms of their military deployment and their intimidation and coercion of neighbors in the Indo-Pacific. So they made that determination in part because they felt that their capabilities had grown, and in part because their patience had lessened to hide and bide. Second, they made a determination to shift increasingly in the direction of state control in their economy. And that was a determination driven by a sense of a political model, an autocratic political model that emphasizes control and centralization. And then third, they made a determination to take aggressive action within the sovereign territory of China to try to exercise that control on the political side as well. And we saw that in their crushing of dissent in Hong Kong. We see it in their egregious activities in Xinjiang and in other places as well. And so those are choices China has made. And it is up to the United States and other members of the international community, including our allies and partners, to determine how we respond to that. The goal is not to contain China. It's not to start a new Cold War. It's not to get into conflict. As the president said, it's to compete vigorously and to push back in service of our values and what we believe to be universal values. And that is the policy that we are conducting now.
And why specifically become so aggressive on Taiwan right now? And what do you do in response? How do you respond firmly without being provocative on Taiwan?
Look, I can't give you an authoritative account of what is driving the PLA decision-making or Xi Jinping's decision-making on incursions into the air defense identification zone of Taiwan, et cetera. We could say broadly is that Xi Jinping, as president of China, has made the Taiwan issue and the need to increase pressure on Taiwan a central feature of their foreign policy. I think he regards it as critical to Chinese prestige and stability over the long term. And the American position on this is quite straightforward. We believe in the One China policy, the full implementation of the Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 assurances. In that, we stand in, we continue in the footsteps of bipartisan consensus in U.S.-China policy going back decades, Democratic administrations, Republican administrations, and we oppose unilateral changes to the status quo. What we would like to see is stability in cross-strait relations and no effort to unilaterally change the status quo. We have communicated that to China. We have affirmed that with Taiwan. We have affirmed that with our partners, including when Prime Minister Suga was here in Washington for a summit with the president. And that is how we are going to continue to approach the Taiwan issue going forward, with steadiness and clarity and resolve with respect to our view that there should be no unilateral changes to the status quo.
And do you perceive a need at the moment to do more in a concrete sense to help Taiwan resist aggression from China?
I believe that we need to continue our obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act to provide defensive assistance to Taiwan so that they have the tools and capabilities they need from a self-defense perspective. I believe that we also need to elevate our concerns with other countries in the Indo-Pacific so that not just the United States, but others are speaking out about the need for stability in cross-strait relations. And I believe that we need to continue to deepen our people-to-people ties to Taiwan in terms of economics and education and the work between two fellow democracies. I mean, Taiwan's performance on COVID-19 is downright remarkable and deserves to be studied, and they deserve to be consulted with on that issue. Taiwan's approach to issues like disinformation and the dealing with the challenge of social media is quite remarkable. And we have a lot to learn from that as well. Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. And so across a number of different issue areas, the United States should be standing up in support of Taiwan, and not to try to escalate or alter the status quo across the strait, but rather to do what two fellow democracies do, which is try to work together to solve significant problems.
So two areas where engagement with China is inevitable, and when one it's already happened, are climate change and trade. So let me just ask you about those two in turn quickly. On climate change, there has been a conversation, there is engagement. The question I have is whether you believe China is serious about engaging and acting on climate change in unison with us, or are we being used by the Chinese, as some of your Republican friends insist?
Well, let me take the second part of that first. Would China like to get away with doing as little as possible on this, like many other countries would like to get away with doing as little as possible? Probably. So we can't come at this issue thinking, this is all just going to work out fine. That's number one. Number two, we are not in the business of treating cooperation with China on climate change as a favor that Beijing is doing for the United States. We do not see it that way. We think action on climate change is a fundamental responsibility of every significant country in the world. And we think action on climate change is fundamentally in the interests of every significant country in the world, including China. So it's no favor to us. We're not going to trade something else off against it. We're not going to concede in other domains in order to elicit cooperation from China on climate change. Those are choices they're going to have to make as a country. And based on what they do or don't do, we will take action accordingly. So I don't accept the critique that somehow suggests we're holding hostage the rest of our policy to climate. Climate is a massive priority for the president and for the United States, as well it should be, but it is not at odds with in any way our capacity or intention to counter China in the areas where we believe we have to do so. On the question of whether they're really prepared to cooperate in a big way, the jury is very much out. Frankly, we have made clear, and the president laid this out in detail at the summit that he hosted of the major countries of the world on climate here at the White House last week, that the 2020s are the critical decade to take action. And simply an objective look at China's plan to date suggests that their main lines of effort are really backloaded as opposed to front-loaded. Secretary Kerry has been working closely with them. I don't want to opine further on the nature of that because I think we need intensive diplomacy and that's best conducted behind closed doors. But the jury is out because of the way that they have designed their pledge to put less emphasis on the near term and more on the long term. And obviously we've asked every country to really look at the next decade as the critical decade.
And on trade, when do you envision engaging with the Chinese on trade, and what should we think the future is for those tariffs that President Trump imposed on China?
We are, first of all, I think 5 weeks into having a U.S. trade representative. Of course, we're 100 days into the administration, but Ambassador Tai was only confirmed a little more than a month ago. Our Commerce Secretary was confirmed around the same time. They are still filling out their teams. And of course, we are in the priority one business right now of making major investments here at home in the United States, first through the American Recovery Plan, and then through trying to advance the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan in Congress. So that's where our effort and priority lie, while Ambassador Tai, Secretary Raimondo, Secretary Yellen, the rest of our team engage with allies and partners around the world on a kind of common understanding of the economic challenge posed by China and trade challenge posed by China, and then common strategy for how to deal with that. So it's going to take some time before we are engaged directly with China in a negotiation over trade issues, and because we are going to want to finalize a pattern of deep consultation with other countries before we do so. and complete a deep study of what we see as the impacts of the tariffs that are currently on the books. And it's not just the tariffs, of course, Jerry, as you know, it's questions related to technology controls. It's issues related to other trade tools and remedies that we have available to us. And so we are working on all of that. And I don't have a particular time frame to lay out for you, only to tell you that that we still need, we have patience, and we are going to be systematic in how we approach this, with the first priority being increasing our position of strength here at home.
So let's turn to that other newly aggressive actor, or continuously aggressive actor on the world stage, Vladimir Putin and Russia. Will there be an early summer summit between President Biden and President Putin?
We are actively discussing that issue. I, in fact, spoke with my counterpart, the Russian National Security Advisor, this morning. We are trying to make plans for a summit this summer in a third country in Europe. No date has been fixed, no location has been fixed, but it's actively under discussion. And President Biden has indicated in his conversations with President Putin and publicly, he believes that such a summit would be valuable in establishing better understandings between our two countries and the possibility of getting this relationship on a more stable, predictable path.
And the president's also made clear that Ukraine, and this is an obvious point, would be near the top of the list on the agenda for such a meeting. Again, I'm going to ask you to put yourself in the mind of a foreign leader. What was President Putin up to on the border of Ukraine over the last few weeks, moving in and moving out? What's the signal to be sent to Ukraine? What's the signal that's meant to be sent to you?
You know, this is one of those cases, Jerry, where I'm going to very directly not answer the question, because, and the reason why is honestly because first, I think there are multiple reasons, but secondly, I think me laying out why Putin was doing what Putin was doing would not be helpful to the engagement that we have going with the Russians. We have taken note of the fact that they have pulled a significant amount of their forces back off the border and returned them to their home bases. This is a constructive step. And I want to leave it at that, because our goal here, particularly where it comes to Ukraine, is to be vigilant and public and unabashed in saying that we support and stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but then to use high-level private diplomatic channels to communicate with the Russians about how we manage this situation going forward, alongside consultations with the Germans, the French, and other key actors in the diplomacy around Ukraine.
So to use a Joe Biden-like phrase, I think the president has tried to signal that he has Ukraine's back. How do you show that? How do you show that to the Ukrainians? How do you show that publicly? What kind of steps are involved in reassuring the Ukrainian government at this point that Joe Biden has their back?
I think there are three main categories to this. The first is that we have an ongoing security relationship with Ukraine, where we provide defensive articles to them and some forms of training. The second is an economic relationship in which we work with the IMF and others to try to bring about significant economic reform within Ukraine, but also help them have a measure of economic stability that will end up providing benefits to the Ukrainian people. And then the third is diplomatic, not just our direct diplomatic engagement with Ukraine and with the Ukrainian people, but our engagement across Europe to have a range of countries standing together with us in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We believe that we can do all of these things and be resolute and firm, while at the same time very much supporting resolution of the conflict, diplomatic progress, de-escalation, all in service of ultimately producing an outcome from the Minsk process that finally fully resolves what is an ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Is there a conversation underway about the potential for sending Ukraine some additional defensive military equipment they could absorb quickly in the event of a crisis?
Well, I said we have an ongoing security relationship. There's not discussion of doing something out of stride, but in stride, the United States has fielded requests from the Ukrainians in the past and supplied them. We'll field requests in the future and be willing to provide certain types of materiel. That's an ongoing dialogue that we have between our security teams and their security teams. But also, Jerry, I just want to take a step back on the broader issue because, what we have seen over the course of the first 100 days in the U.S.-Russia relationship, I think, has been President Biden basically being very clear from the outset what he intended to do and then following through on doing it. And I think that bears noting. So he basically said, look, first, we're going to stand up in defense of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of our partners. And we're going to be firm about that. And he's done that with respect to Ukraine. He will continue to do so. Second, he said, if Russia takes harmful actions against the United States and our intelligence community determines that they are responsible, we will respond. And he did that. Third, he said, we will work with Russia where it's in our interest to do so. And in the first 15 days, we extended the New START treaty on nuclear weapons by 5 years without qualification. And then fourth, he said, overall, his goal with Russia is actually to put this relationship on a more stable, predictable, effective footing. And he believes leader-level engagement is critical for that. He's talked to Putin twice by phone and looks forward to meeting with him in person. For me, this is a hallmark of President Biden's overall approach to foreign policy. It's principled, it's pragmatic, it's rooted in personal engagement with leaders, and it's three-dimensional. It's not just all one thing or all another. It's trying to manage a complex and difficult relationship in a way that stays true to American interests. I know that wasn't directly your question, but I actually think for the audience, understanding how he's approached Russia in the first 100 days tells you a fair amount about how he's looking at U.S. foreign policy over the course of the next 4 years.
Jake, can you hear me and see me?
Jake, I think you're muted, and we
Okay. Yes.
Jerry. There you go.
I'm here. Sorry, I put myself on mute and couldn't unmute. So yes, Nick, I could hear and see you, and Anya, I can hear you.
Good. I think we've lost Jerry just for a moment. I apologize, but we're just going to filibuster here and continue to ask you questions before we get Jerry back. I certainly just wanted to ask you a question about NATO. I've been impressed by what the President, Secretary Blinken, and you have been doing to strengthen it and in general, to build up the power of our alliances as we seek to contain Russia and compete with China. Can you talk about both your East-West strategy and our alliances?
Sure. So first, Nick, it's great to see you. And I'm hoping at some point here, you'll be responsible for all of our problems and for solving them. Second, the president has committed actually to going to Brussels in June for a NATO summit. And the central question at that summit is, what does the next 10 years of NATO look like? We had a strategic concept in 2010. We're now a decade on from that, and it's time to look at a strategic concept for the next decade. And that is about reinforcing the basic foundations of NATO, starting with Article 5, starting with collective defense and interoperability and burden sharing and all the principles that have guided NATO through the decades. But then it's also about retooling the alliance for the challenges of the future. That includes a much more effective approach alliance-wide on cyber, where we face considerable threats from both Russia and China. It means having NATO think about partnerships, not just on the periphery of Europe or in the Middle East or in South Asia, but in the Indo-Pacific as well. not to extend the formal alliance, but rather to conceive of security in a much more holistic global way. It means thinking about security challenges that don't fall in the military domain at all, whether it is disinformation or it is corruption as a foreign policy weapon, and how NATO as an alliance begins to conceive of the nature of security beyond the very tight, effective military cooperation and engagement that has been the hallmark and the kind of fundamental identity of NATO in the past. So that's what we are working towards. Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin have both spent a considerable amount of time with their counterparts on this, I with mine, and President Biden, there will be a culmination of that when he goes to the summit. The last thing that I will say on this is NATO has been central to the Resolute Support Mission in Afghanistan, and the president's decision to end the American military presence there was a coordinated decision with all of our NATO allies that we were in together, we'll be out together, and we are currently working hand in hand on a military drawdown that is combined with a common strategy around our continuing diplomatic development, humanitarian intelligence, and security partnership with the Afghan government going forward. So that will also be high on the agenda come June, even as we're kind of looking out to the future to great power challenges and other non-traditional threats.
Thank you.
And Jake, it's been equally interesting to see your focus, the president's focus, the administration's focused on our Indo-Pacific allies and partners. Steve Biegun was on earlier this morning on this program. He's still with us. Steve pointed out that President Trump revived the Quad, and I think you have to give the Trump administration credit for that. But President Biden has taken it to a place it's never been before, a head of government summit. Do you believe that the Quad can be an effective limit on China's egregious behavior in the Indo-Pacific?
First of all, absolutely credit where credit is due. I mean, the Quad was invented actually in the Bush administration in the wake of the Asian tsunami. It continued under the Obama administration, but really was boosted and elevated in a significant way under the Trump administration and the notion of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And it was upon that platform that we built the first leaders level summit that took place a few weeks ago. We believe that the Quad is an incredible platform for 4 highly capable democracies to deal with a range of challenges from COVID to climate to disaster relief to maritime security, and to help set the rules of the road on everything from cyber and emerging technology to freedom of navigation. What I would say about the China piece of it is what was so interesting about the summit is, yes, of course, they talked about China and the challenge posed by China. But in a way, what makes the Quad so effective is that the Quad is not fundamentally about China. It's about this affirmative agenda that these 4 capable democracies can set. And the outcome of that, not the point of it, but the outcome of it is to create a better context and atmosphere for managing China's behavior, activities, aggression in effective ways. I know that sounds a little like Diplo speak, but it's really important that we think about these kinds of partnerships, whether it's US-EU or it's Quad or it's NATO, as not being fundamentally aimed at another country, but rather aimed at a theory of the international system that is rooted in rules-based, values-based, humane approaches. And if we do that work, then our collective capacity to deal with China, to deal with Russia, to deal with other countries will be much greater. That's how we think about it. And that to me is the difference between a 2-dimensional kind of, we're just going at this other country, and a 3-dimensional approach where the practical result of it will be that we are in a better position to manage the challenges and the competition that we face from China.
Right. Thank you so much, Jake. We've got Jerry back. I think he lost power briefly. And Jerry, in your absence, we've talked about NATO and we've covered the Quad. So we'll let you take back over from here. Thanks.
Great, thank you. If I was a conspiracy theorist, I wonder why I was lost. But actually, the gale force winds here knocked the power out ever so briefly here. So anyway, fingers crossed. And because Nick is really smart, he stole my question on the quad, so I won't have to ask that one. There is a kind of a broader question, though, Jake, about both the China and Russia relationship. And this is something you and I have talked about a bit in the past, which is how great is the danger here that, particularly on the Chinese side, that they start to believe the narrative that they tell themselves, which is that the West and the US in particular are in a state of decline, an inevitable and long decline, and therefore the field is more open to them, and that they miscalculate as a result of that. That could be true for the Russians or the Chinese or others as far as that's concerned. How great a danger is that in your mind?
I think you put your finger on what is one of the fundamental dynamics facing the world today, which is the question that China is asking, Russia is asking, but frankly, so is the rest of the world. Is the United States in particular, but the West in general, on the way down? And you heard from President Biden on Wednesday night in his address to the nation, his laser focus on the issue of whether democracies can deliver in a time of profound change and upheaval, whether they can deliver economically, whether they can deliver political cohesion, whether they can deliver against everything from COVID-19 to technological change. And his answer to that question is they absolutely can if we put in the work. And this next decade will be decisive as historians look back to providing a positive answer to the question, can democracies deliver? And he's really focused on that as one of the central organizing principles of his presidency. And that's why foreign policy is domestic policy and domestic policy is foreign policy, because our capacity to reinforce the fundamental sources of American strength, our infrastructure, our innovation, our democracy itself, will be decisive in how we shape the perceptions of both competitors and adversaries on the one hand and allies and partners on the other hand. And I think we're off to a good start in the first 100 days. I think China is taking note of the fact that our projected growth rate now after the American Recovery Plan is 6.5% this year. They're taking note of the far-reaching investments in infrastructure and innovation and R&D and education and American families that the president has laid out. They're taking note of the fact that we have been able to reinvigorate our alliances and elevate new groupings like the Quad. And I think it is making them think twice about how comfortable they can be simply sitting back and assuming the United States is on its way down. The last point I'll make on this is that in Beijing, in capitals throughout the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the rest of the world, there is a residual understanding that one of the great capacities of the United States that we've exercised repeatedly in the past is the capacity for renewal, regeneration, error correction, and that we can come back. We were flat on our backs on COVID a year ago, and now we are on a very positive trajectory here at home and are turning to try to end this pandemic around the world and so much else. So, my view is that this is the central strategic question facing us, and our success depends on the kinds of investments that we can make and cohesion we can build here in the United States. And it's why, as National Security Advisor, I concern myself so much with the work of the National Economic Council and Domestic Policy Council, not because I'm just butting into other people's business, but because it's our business too in national security. So I'm sorry for a long and somewhat animated answer to your question, but I think it's a really profoundly important subject.
No, thank you for that. Let me just touch on a couple of other areas and then we'll open it up to audience questions. You won't be surprised I'm going to ask you about Iran. How could I not? Twofold question here. Are the Iranians negotiating in good faith, in your estimation, on the return to JCPOA? And are they showing willingness to talk about extending the life of the agreement, expanding it to include ballistic missiles, and expanding it to include behavior beyond Iran's borders in the region?
So I'm not going to characterize the substance of the negotiations at this point because they're in I would say, a sort of unclear place in Vienna, meaning that we've seen willingness of all sides, including the Iranians, to talk seriously about sanctions relief and nuclear restrictions and a pathway back into the JCPOA. But it is still uncertain as to whether this will culminate in a deal in Vienna in the coming weeks. So while the diplomacy is ongoing and underway, I don't want to get into the specifics of what's on the table and what's being negotiated and discussed. On the question of whether they're negotiating in good faith, I guess good faith is always in the eye of the beholder. I believe the Iranians have come in a serious way to have serious discussions about details, and the teams are working through those details now. And so this is not just, one side or the other giving the runaround. It's a real negotiation, albeit an indirect negotiation, which is more inefficient, of course. Whether it will result in a positive outcome or not remains to be determined.
So final quick question from me. Afghanistan, we know the president's decision on troop levels. What I'm curious about is how you would characterize the capability and capacity the U.S. will still have post September in Afghanistan to deter terrorism and extremist activity, intelligence, special operations over the horizon, projection forces. How robust will that capability be in the wake of troop withdrawal?
Well, as members of the administration have testified, both in open session and behind closed doors on the Hill, it won't be the same capability, but we believe it will be a sufficient capability, meaning that between what we can do in terms of maintaining an intelligence picture for the reemergence of a terrorist threat to the U.S. homeland in Afghanistan, and then what we can maintain in terms of a military posture in the region to be able to respond if that threat does reemerge, we think that we can disrupt and suppress the threat so that it does not become an acute threat to the United States or to American interests. That will include a number of arrangements with countries in the region. I don't want to go into specifics on that. It will include continued provision of security assistance to the Afghan National Security Forces directly. And it will include close cooperation and consultation with other partners who have been involved in the fight in Afghanistan from NATO and elsewhere, who have their own capabilities that we will continue to rely upon. So we believe that we will be effectively postured to deal with this on a going forward basis, and that actually repositioning capabilities will put us in a better position overall to deal with the threat of terrorism writ large in the world, which, as the president has pointed out, has become more dispersed and distributed across Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia from where it stood 20 years ago when the United States went into Afghanistan in the first place.
Jake, thank you very much. I appreciated the chance. And I think Anya is going to step in here and deal with audience questions, of which I think there are already many.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jerry. And Jake, thanks for the tour de force around the world. We've got a number of people excited to ask you questions. We want to get you out of here on time, but I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask you the same thing that Jennifer Griffin asked Tom Donilon and Steve Biegun this morning. You've been there for 100 days. You said it's been a lot of sleepless nights, which we empathize with. What has been for you the most poignant or important or difficult day?
Wow, that's a hard question. I think I don't have a good answer. It was, it's funny. I was with a group of my team yesterday, and someone posed a different version of this question, which was, kind of the high low. What was your best? What's been the best moment in the first 100 days and the worst? And honestly, I couldn't come up with the best, and I couldn't come up with the worst. And maybe that's just some kind of tragic Irish sensibility that, we're just kind of doing our thing here. I guess poignant. The thing that has hit me hardest emotionally, and this is in a positive way, but also in kind of an epic way, was the president's speech on Wednesday night. and listening to him from the dais lay things out the way that he did, the culmination of 100 days of work, that kind of washed over me in kind of a profound and emotional way. I am very proud of what we did with the Quad Summit. I thought that was just a significant moment that's really set us up for success going forward. We've had difficult days with attacks on air bases in Iraq that have led to the loss of life of Americans, not service members, but contractors. And we had to choose, the president had to choose to take military action in response to that. That weighed heavily. And then managing these great power relationships, both China and Russia, are kind of require constant focus and attention. But unfortunately, I think I'm giving you a very lame answer to your question about what the most poignant moment was. I promise at the 200-day mark, I'll have a better answer.
No, it's a great answer. And you have a lot of accomplishments already under your belt for just 100 days in. So we hope from all of us that you get a little more sleep. Without further ado, let me turn first to Catherine Eng, who's one of our rising leaders, and she works in the tech industry. So Catherine, please.
Hi, thanks for taking the time. I'm Catherine. I've been working on APAC tech issues at Facebook, and prior to that was lucky enough to work for Steve Hadley and Anya at RHGM. My question is about digital sovereignty. Sovereignty today has acquired a digital dimension, and we certainly see that with China. It also seems like the EU has its own digital sovereignty agenda in certain ways. Like, for example, with GDPR, it's great that it's empowering the individual to decide how a company uses its data, but some voices in the EU are calling for bolder antitrust policies, while other critics interpret this as erecting trade barriers against large foreign tech companies. I think the outcomes of this week's G7 digital ministerial are really encouraging, but given EU ambitions, how will the US work effectively with the EU on a potential multilateral tech policy framework when our approaches to data governance are kind of different, and also at a time when we don't have a federal framework ourselves and we're trying to build stronger alliances to counter China? And how much does the EU's dependence on China as a market inhibit progress on cooperation? Thanks.
Thanks. That's a big set of questions. And as a good manager of the interagency process in the US government, I'm going to give a little bit of a process answer to it, because there's a huge number of complex questions implicated in what you just laid out. Some differences of opinion between the US and Europe on forms of digital regulation, but a lot of commonalities as well, including on questions related to the need for effective antitrust and pro-competition rules, even if the details we'll have to work through. So the way that we're looking at this is building into the G7, as you mentioned, to try to align around a set of principles, and the tech G7 outcomes were a positive step in that direction. Second, the president will do a summit in Brussels with the presidents of the European Union, the president of the Commission, the president of the Council. And from that summit, our goal is to structure an effective dialogue on the whole range of trade and technology issues that will allow us to get onto the same page, both resolve disputes among us, but then develop a common strategy around our highest priority issues as it relates to reform of the international system, and in certain cases, how to deal with the challenges posed by non-market economies like China. So that's what we intend. Those are going to be some tough conversations, in some cases, some tough negotiations where we try to come to a give and take on certain issues in the technology space. But our convergence dramatically outweighs our differences. And I think if we can manage those differences and resolve them effectively through a structured dialogue, then our partnership together will put us in a position to enhance the rules of the road in the digital space globally for the benefit of all of our citizens.
Thank you, Jake. Actually, from Aspen Strategy Group in Munich is working on a project together that covers tech and Europe and what we can do together. So I'm glad you guys are focusing on it. Can we go next to Joe Nye, please? Joe, are you there?
Yes. Hi, Jake. I would like to ask you about COVID. The Biden administration has done a great job on vaccinations, but we're not there yet. And yet at the same time, we're facing real emergencies in India, Brazil, and other countries. The administration has announced that it will export $60 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine when we deem it safe. But the emergency in India and Brazil is now. Is it plausible and possible that we could start exporting some of our own vaccines, such as the Johnson & Johnson or the Moderna or the Pfizer, even before we finished our full vaccinations at home? The argument for that is it would be good for us in the long run, good for our alliances, good for our soft power, but it poses political problems. What are the prospects for doing something like that?
Joe, it's great to see you. And I should not have anticipated anything less than a very direct, very fair, very hard question to answer. But what the president, first of all, the AstraZeneca doses are our own doses. Those are doses that we acquired and paid for the purpose of using here. We've, of course, determined that we're unlikely to have, or we're not going to have AstraZeneca as part of the mix. And so as soon as they're ready, we will send them. President hasn't made a determination about sending additional doses at this moment, but he is very focused, and you heard him in the speech on Wednesday night, specifically refer to the need to become an important source of vaccines for the world. And so, in fact, when I finish this conversation here in the next little while, I'm going almost immediately into a meeting, which we are now holding on a regular basis, for how to formulate our global COVID strategy, how to advance the provision of vaccines, the production first, and then provision of vaccines to the rest of the world. And we will have more to say on that subject in the not too distant future. I wish I could give you a better answer than that, but that's where things stand right now. We are working through what our options are, and we're trying to do that expeditiously so that as soon as humanly possible, we'll be in a position to say, we've got more to offer the world.
That will be great. We look forward to that. Jendai Fraser, I think we have you up next. Jendai was our Assistant Secretary for Africa and also Ambassador to South Africa.
Thank you very much, Anya. And it's a great pleasure. And I'm going to ask you, Jake, Africa policy. It follows on Joe's. I promise you I was going to ask this even before Joe spoke. But first, let me just say thank you for your leadership in two things that I think were critical for U.S. Africa, and that was the decision to approve Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the DG of the WTO, as well as the very strong and positive message that President Biden gave to the AU summit at the beginning of his administration. I think that those really were strong signals. Now, my question, I think cyber, climate, and COVID are exactly right anchors, and there could be a lot that happens with U.S. Africa policy on those areas. Principled, pragmatic, and personal engagement is exactly what the continent needs. I'd like to ask you, what is your vision for U.S. Africa policy? But following on Joe, but again, as I said, I was going to ask this anyway. I think that really COVID recovery in Africa, we could have so much advantage there. The fact that the U.S. government is the largest foreign aid contributor in the world, and 75% of our foreign aid to Africa goes to the health sector, building on the strong capacity that we built there through the PEPFAR program, giving the leading role of our private sector, particularly, with vaccine development and testing development. There's just a lot we can do, and China's dangling some PPE out there and getting great advantage, and even vaccines that aren't very effective. And so I just want to push you again on the point that Joe raised about US leadership on COVID. And right now, some of our positions are actually hurting our companies. For instance, when we say ID now can't be exported to other countries in the world, there's a resentment that comes up. And I know in Africa, they say, so America's just taking care of itself, as always, and just leaving us, we're last in line. So I think our current position is hurting us. And we have so much capability actually in this country to take strategic, I shouldn't say advantage, but we have a strategic role to play in the world to solve problems that will do just what Joe said, which was build that soft power. So that's a bit long-winded to say congratulations on all of the great work that you all are already doing. What's your vision for Africa? And specifically, how can we leverage the COVID recovery global approach?
Thanks, Chendai. Let me say in answer to what I think was a very compelling presentation of both the challenge and the opportunity, we fully recognize that there is an urgent need for the United States to step up to the plate to deliver for the world to end this pandemic and then to help the world recover from this pandemic. Vaccines are part of that. And, our 60 million AstraZeneca is a step, but billions of doses ultimately are needed. And that's going to mean manufacture, logistics, and getting shots in arms. And the United States, over the coming weeks, will be elaborating a fuller strategy for how we intend to be at the vanguard of helping Africa and the rest of the world both get vaccinated and then bounce back. Another piece of the bouncing back, of course, is economic. And the United States is fully committed to thinking about the kinds of investments required, not just to build back better in the United States, but to build back better worldwide. Climate, health, digital, gender equity. These are all areas where we are going to look to work with like-minded partners to mobilize both public and private capital, not just for debt, but for equity investments. And we will have more to say on that subject in the coming months as well. So between the kinds of big economic moves that we can make and what we can do on the public health front, this is going to be a paramount focus of our foreign policy over the course of the next year. And with the aim of ending the pandemic, not in 2024, but in 2022. And we will do everything in our power as we go forward to be able to accomplish that.
Great. Let's hope we can get there. Jake, I have a question for you from Paul Shankman from U.S. News and World Report.
Yes, hi. Thanks very much for taking my question. Mr. Sullivan, does the president believe that he has the authority to order all military members to take the coronavirus vaccine, a coronavirus vaccine, while it's still under emergency authorization? And does he have any political concerns about ordering something that appears to be so unpopular among some members of the uniformed force? Thank you.
I'm just going to leave it at that's something that the Department of Defense is looking at in consultation with the interagency process, and don't have anything to add on that subject here today.
Great. Sounds good. And we want to be respectful of your time, so I'm going to make this the last question, and it's from Bob Hormats, who, of course, was senior official at the U.S. State Department. Hey, Bob.
Hi, how are you? Thanks very much. Hello, Jake.
Hi, Bob.
On China, you mentioned very early on that China wanted to be preeminent in technology of various sorts. The US has certainly the capability of advancing quite dramatically in areas like 5G, quantum computing, AI. One of the traditions of American policy is collaboration between the government and the private sector on these things that are dual use. They can be commercially used and they can be of military use. Are there some plans? Of course, the president wants also for us to be preeminent and also to create a lot more domestic jobs. Are there any plans, or is there a program whereby we can boost or step up our collaboration between the government and the private sector to leap ahead of China in these several areas? One, is strategically important, and two, economically important, creating a lot of jobs at home. Is this a high priority? And if so, what are the next steps and what can be done about it?
Thanks, Bob. Great question. And the answer is emphatically yes. In fact, a central proposition of the American Jobs Plan is to have significant public investment in key areas: clean energy, biotechnology, advanced electronics, semiconductors, with the goal of mobilizing private sector innovation, private sector job creation, and that foundation of basic research, creating whole new industries alongside millions of good paying jobs. That's what the American Jobs Plan is all about. And just as one example, part of the American Jobs Plan is focused on the semiconductor industry. There's also a bill moving through the Congress now on a bipartisan basis called the CHIPS Act. And what the CHIPS Act says is the United States government is prepared to step up, not to pick winners and losers, but to make investments in the fabrication and manufacturing capacity of semiconductors as chips here in the United States. And the government will put skin in the game and the private sector will put skin in the game. And the result will be a combination of good paying union jobs in America, plus the security that comes from having a resilient supply chain of these chips. And that is a central part of what we're trying to accomplish with the economic strategy of the Biden administration. It goes back to the point I was making before about foreign policy being domestic policy and vice versa. It's why the work of the National Economic Council is so central to the success of our national security strategy.
Great. Jake, thank you so much. We'll leave it there and let you go back to your important work. Thank you for sharing with us some of the vast array of issues that are on your plate. For all of you out there in the audience, we wish we could be in person, and we have an announcement for you. We're hard at work working on the 2021 Aspen Security Forum. Regretfully, we've decided that in August, it's just too soon for so many of us to be safely together in Aspen. So the Security Forum will meet virtually from the 3rd to the 5th of August, but then we are planning an in-person event in November. And we have a great lineup already for those two events. Foreign Minister Jaishankar of India, the Prime Minister of Singapore, several US cabinet level officials and senior officials. So we look forward to seeing all of you there. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend.